Is the use of cable television programming as a teaching resource.
The U.S. Congress held its first hearing investigating the World Trade Center bombing in New York City. The blast killed 5 people, wounded about 1,000 others, and shut down the World Trade Center for what officials say will be several weeks. Several arrests have been made in connection with this case. For the next 4.5 hours, we'll bring you Tuesday's hearing of the House Judiciary Subcommittee on Crime and Criminal Justice. Members heard from international scholars, terrorism experts, and a variety of officials involved in the investigation of the bombing. Witnesses include New York City Mayor David Dinkins, New York City Police Commissioner Raymond Kelly, and FBI Director William Sessions. This hearing was chaired by Representative Charles Schumer, a Democrat from New York.
Committee will come to order. The chair has received a request to cover this hearing in whole or in part by television broadcast, radio broadcast, still photography, or other similar methods. In accordance with Committee Rule 5, permission will be granted unless there is an objection. Without objection. Okay. Well, good morning, everyone, and I want to thank everybody for coming. During the past few weeks, Americans have come to realize that the scourge of international terrorism does indeed have a domestic face. They've seen it in the television reports from New York City as a result of the terrorist bombing of the World Trade Center Twin Towers. They've just seen it in the recent assassination of CIA workers just outside Washington by a Pakistani national who then escaped to Pakistan. And they have seen it in the increasing reports and allegations that Middle East terrorist groups may be receiving financial support and political direction from centers here in America. Can we get the door closed? Yeah, thanks. According to some federal law enforcement officials and terrorism experts we'll hear from today, we may well see more, not less, of the domestic connection for extremist political groups determined to attack this country. The question is not whether America is vulnerable to domestic terrorism. The World Trade Center bombing clearly shows that we are, but rather, what are we prepared to do about it? We must regard the terrorism at the World Trade Center as a wake-up call, as a shot across the bow, importuning us to act. What tools do we need to place in the hands of our federal and local law enforcement agencies to help them protect all of us, while still preserving the openness and freedom of our everyday lives? We've been lucky over the years, managing to stay relatively clear of political terrorism here at home. But now, in the wake of the New York bombing and other incidents, we must reassess the threat, re-examine our counter-terrorist capabilities, and ask the hard questions about such things as airport security and delays in dealing with obvious abuses of our immigration policies. There are other broad questions we need to explore. Are our borders too open? Can they be tightened without impeding the freedom of movement that Americans and our welcomed foreign guests expect in a free country? Are weapons and explosives too available? And, given the common variety of materials apparently used in the World Trade Center bombing, what are the implications of restrictions on such materials? Go ahead. Sit, Craig. It's all right. Sit. It's all right. Are there reasonable precautions we can take to improve security in our public buildings? In some, are our laws tough enough? We are justifiably proud of our free and open society. We do not want to close borders and establish draconian security measures on every street corner in our society. But surely there are steps between a secure but completely closed state and a totally open but dangerously vulnerable society that prudent people will want to examine. I've already formed some ideas regarding domestic terrorism, and I've incorporated them into a single bill, which I and my colleague Jim Sensenbrenner are introducing today, the Terrorism Prevention and Protection Act of 1993. This will be a preliminary version of the bill, and it's my hope that the bill will become a focus for the debate on the issues we're raising here today. The legislation will, among other things, establish a new federal offense for domestic terrorism and another for providing material support to terrorists. Another feature of the bill will be to require tagans, microscopic chemicals that can easily be identified in all explosives manufactured and sold in the United States. This technologically feasible and relatively simple process can be of enormous value in quickly tracing commonly available explosives like dynamite. The bill will establish pre-inspection stations in international airports to help keep illegal aliens from entering the country. And the bill will make additional tools available to law enforcement to gather intelligence and prevent domestic terrorism. The legislation is strong medicine, but the threat is a serious one. It is a threat we have already taken far too lightly. Some of the problems lie in how we're executing existing laws and policies. For example, I've been personally very frustrated by the situation involving Sheikh Omar Abdul Rahman, a one-time resident of Brooklyn. His history as a known terrorist is well known, both here and in Egypt. I'll leave for law enforcement to make the determination as to what, if any, role beyond inspiration that Rahman may have played in the World Trade Center bombing and his relationship to the accused bomber Mohammed Salameh. But the simple fact is that Sheikh Rahman is a perfect example of the failure of our present immigration laws to deal adequately with dangerous aliens who seek to abuse our open society. Sheikh Rahman is clearly a candidate for deportation. He entered this country on a tourist visa obtained under false pretenses. Yet, he has managed to remain here for more than 2.5 years, preaching his political message of hate and violence, and boasting of terrorist acts his followers have committed in Egypt. I am still waiting for a response from the Immigration and Naturalization Service to my call in January, before this terrible act occurred, for the immediate deportation of Sheikh Rahman. And I'm also puzzled, frankly, by the muted response from the FBI to my request last month to examine reports alleging financial and political links between the Middle East terrorist organization Hamas and operatives here in the United States. These are among the many open questions we'll be looking at this hearing and in the months ahead. With regard to the World Trade Center specifically, I'm confident that our skilled law enforcement community will continue to make progress and that everyone involved in this cowardly act of terror will be identified, prosecuted, and punished. I hope we can hear today as much as possible regarding progress in the case, but, and I ask my colleagues to respect this, within the confines of not compromising any ongoing investigation. More than the specifics, however, this hearing of the Subcommittee on Crime and Criminal Justice is intended to begin the process of addressing the broader issues raised by this crime and hopefully to allay the fears of the American people. Clearly, few Americans have remained unmoved by the tragedy and drama that unfolded in the World Trade Center bombing. Our hearts go out to the families of the innocent victims, and our heartfelt thanks go to the men and women of the FBI, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, the New York City Police, and the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, whose extraordinary efforts have put us on an early road to solving this crime. Let me say that when the decisive action, the arrests were made, the nation breathed a sigh of relief. My city, New York City, breathed a double sigh of relief. The cut in the tension on the streets of New York City were palpable the day the arrests were announced. And I want to thank, heartfelt, all of our law enforcement, federal and local, for the job that they did. We're grateful to the distinguished witnesses today as well from the State Department, the FBI, ATF, and the New York City Police Department, the Port Authority, and for our panel of distinguished non-government experts on terrorism for being here today to share perspective and expertise, and we look forward to your testimony. And now let me turn to the ranking minority member, Mr. Sensenbrenner, for any opening remarks he may have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I mentioned as a starting point that this hearing relates to an ongoing criminal investigation. Appropriate safeguards must be observed so as not to prejudice the investigation and prosecution of this case. On Friday, February 26, 1993, at lunchtime, an explosion in a parking garage below the nation's largest commercial office building killed at least 5, with more than 1,000 injured and at least 1 missing. Perhaps 1,000 to 1,500 pounds of explosives were used, and if so, this would be the largest device of its kind set off in the United States, according to the Washington Times. While the motive for the bombing is not yet perfectly clear, the relationship between 2 arrested suspects, Mr. Salome and Mr. El-Gabrowni, on one hand, and the blind cleric on the other, has begun to attract law enforcement attention it may long have deserved. Specifically, Sheikh Omar Abdul Rahman, a radical Islamic cleric who faces possible deportation, was questioned in the Rabbi Meir Kahane assassination but not charged. The blind 54-year-old Jersey City cleric was charged in Egypt with sanctioning the 1981 assassination of Egyptian President Anwar Sadat. Sheikh Omar denies responsibility for the Trade Center bombing. While the ties between the 2 defendants and the Sheikh are yet to be fully developed, Mr. Salome sometimes prayed at a mosque where the Sheikh used to preach. At least one news source reports that the second defendant named under obstruction of justice charges, Mr. El-Gabrowni, is among the Sheikh's closest associates in the United States. Likewise, Mr. Salome used Mr. El-Gabrowni's address on his driver's license application. It is my hope that the witnesses will elaborate on the relevance of this fact to the rental of the Ryder truck implicated in the explosion, to the paperwork related to the rental, and any searches conducted by law enforcement to date. Moreover, Mr. El-Gabrowni is the cousin of El Said Nosser, the man sentenced to 7 to 23 years for charges related to the murder of Rabbi Meir Kahane. There are still other ties between the Sheikh and Mr. El-Gabrowni. The Wall Street Journal notes that in December of 1992, Sheikh Omar told that paper, quote, "It is the duty of all good Muslims to rebel against tyrants," unquote. He added that he would like to, quote, "show all Americans that they'll never be happy if they don't follow Islam," unquote. According to the Wall Street Journal, the blind Sheikh has also preached holy war or jihad against the great Satan, the United States, and has been investigated by the FBI in connection with 3 killings, including the 1990 murder of Rabbi Kahane. To my knowledge, in none of these cases is the Sheikh thought to have pulled the trigger, placed the bomb, or otherwise done the actual act. Yet he did give religious approval or fatwa to these cases and for the bombing. More to the point, I must ask and wonder, how did Sheikh Omar get into this country under the watchful eyes of our immigration and law enforcement authorities? How did Sheikh Omar get a visa when the Egyptian government charged him with issuing an approval, fatwa, or sanctioning the 1981 assassination of President Sadat? Why is he still in the United States, and why has he not been deported? And what is he doing in our country? Is there a loophole in the current immigration laws in this area or in the enforcement thereof? When the 54-year-old blind cleric came to the United States in 1990 on a tourist visa, he was on the official U.S. terrorist list. The press reports that the United States Embassy in Sudan made a mistake when it issued Sheikh Omar a tourist visa. His green card permitting him to stay and work as a cleric was revoked in March of 1992. On January 20th, 1993, the Sheikh appeared in federal court in a hearing to request political asylum and to respond to United States charges that he lied on his visa application, that he is a polygamist, and that he has committed crimes of moral turpitude. That case is pending before an immigration judge. The World Trade Center explosion, however, did not await the turning of the wheels of justice. Mr. Chairman, my heart goes out to those injured physically and or economically due to the blast, and of course to those who lost loved ones, as well as to the family of the individual still missing. I hope my questions will be answered during this hearing. I also hope to learn what this case means for the future, and finally to reiterate to those listening the assurance that Congress will act to prevent and punish severely and swiftly acts of violence by enemies, whether they be domestic or foreign. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sensenbrenner. Mr. Edwards?
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I add my congratulations to the FBI and the police agencies involved in this case. And Mr. Sensenbrenner and Mr. Schumer are both former members of the subcommittee that I've chaired for many years, which has jurisdiction over the FBI and their work on terrorism, against terrorism, national and international. And we also have the jurisdiction of the old House Un-American Activity Committee on alleged subversive activities. So we have worked very closely with the Bureau on in their work on counterterrorism for many years. The record of the FBI in counterterrorism has been remarkable. There's only been one incident of international terrorism in the United States since 1983. Over a 5-year period, 1987 to 1991, the FBI prevented 24 terrorism incidents before they could even get started. That's an extraordinary record and is a product of skillful and hard work by the FBI. The FBI fulfills its counterterrorism duties pursuant to very strict guidelines. Some are classified. These guidelines balance the security interests of the United States with the constitutional rights of the people and of a free society. I would urge my colleagues to question the argument that our open society leaves us vulnerable to terrorism. To the contrary, our democratic processes, tolerance for diversity, and commitment to opportunity leave no fertile ground for terrorism to flourish. I'm concerned that if the New York incident is hyped up, if it is used to encourage hysteria or fear, then indeed our liberties can be imperiled. Nobody in this country should be investigated, must not be investigated because of their religion, race, or place of birth. To a limited extent, but still unfortunate extent, this did happen during the Gulf War. Many loyal Americans of Arab descent were harassed not only by certain members of the public, but by federal and state police agencies. This must not happen because of the New York bombing. I would also hope that all of us involved in the issues be prudent and responsible in our public statements. Inexcusable leaks in this case have already damaged the ongoing investigation. It would have been better if certain details about the FBI techniques used had not been made public. Unproven speculations about the possible involvement of foreign governments should wait for proof. The world should be clear, everybody should be clear, as my chairman made clear, that the FBI will solve this bombing. It might take a while, and those of us in Congress must take the leadership role in urging patience. But those responsible will be identified. The necessary laws and intelligence mechanisms are very much in place to protect this nation from terrorism. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Edwards, and I think our entire committee shares your admonitions and views. Mr. Mazzola, no, Mr. Schiff.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for holding this hearing. If I'm correct, this is the first hearing the Congress has held specifically on this bombing incident in New York. It provides a forum for the public to see and hear the witnesses as we see and hear them and learn about this tragic situation as much as can be learned about this time. Certainly, in addition to the seriousness of any crime, a terrorist act or possible terrorist act has a special concern and threat for the American people. I just want to briefly echo two concerns that I've already heard from my colleagues, Mr. Sensenbrenner and Mr. Edwards. First, At the time this hearing was first scheduled, there were no publicly known suspects, and now there are. There are individuals now in custody. And speaking for myself, and I trust endorsed by the chairman, I would certainly ask the witnesses that if they're asked a question, the answer to which they feel would prejudice the future trial of this matter, my encouragement would be for them not to answer the question on those particular grounds, and I think we would understand. Second of all, I want to express the concern expressed by Mr. Edwards. I've seen members of the Muslim community in the United States, particularly Muslims of Arab descent, express great concern because of the public discussion of possible radical fundamentalist involvement. And it should be emphasized that even if that involvement is proven at some future time in court, that the radical sect that advocates violence among this group is not representative of the mainstream group of Muslim believers in this country or elsewhere. And I would share the caution that one irrational act not be followed by other irrational acts around the country. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Mr. Mazzoli. Mr. Nadler, by the way, is not a member of the subcommittee, but has asked to sit in on the hearing because the World Trade Center is in his area, and
thank you.
We welcome that.
Mr. Chairman, I'll be brief, and I thank you very much for having called these hearings. They should be very helpful to us in trying to ferret out not only what went on from the standpoint of how this terrible situation could have occurred, but I think the gentleman in his opening statement touched on a number of bills that he and I have worked on in the past in the immigration field that could very well get additional impetus and momentum as a result of this hearing and as a result of these factors. I think it ought to be borne in mind, as our chairman has counseled us, and that is that the self-same laws that may have permitted individuals, perhaps related to this case, to stay on in this country for longer periods of time, to perhaps preach venomous comments and preach hatred, are the very self-same rules that allow people of modest means and of no inclination in those directions to have their cases for asylum looked at carefully and examined with great deliberation. So we have to be careful, obviously, as the chairman has counseled us, not to go too far in any direction because of our understandable disgust at what happened from the human toil and from the economic standpoint, and also from the situation of the fear that this might somehow inculcate in the American people. But within that context of not going too far, I think the gentleman and I and others in our committees can work together and fashion a series of bills that I think will be helpful. So I appreciate the gentleman's hearings and look forward to working with him.
And I want to thank him for all his help in the legislation that we moved through his committee and to the floor last year. Maybe this year we can get it done. Mr. Glickman, who has in the process of just finishing up some oral surgery and was made every effort to be here.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity to make a statement this morning regarding the recent events at the World Trade Center. Clearly, the bombing has shed a new light on the law enforcement and crime prevention in the United States. The law enforcement officials, and particularly the FBI and the New York City Police Department, who have worked on this case, have so far done an excellent job in finding the needle in the haystack. But the fact that the needle was ever placed there is a concern to us all. All of us are feeling a bit more vulnerable since this bombing, and I'm glad to know that we are getting right to work to find out how and why this could have happened. This bombing has implications for our intelligence community. As chairman of the Intelligence Committee, I am holding an Intelligence Committee hearing this afternoon with Director Woolsey to generally discuss the future of the agency, and this incident will be discussed there as well. I am disturbed by the ease with which this crime was committed and the potential for mass disaster that was just barely averted. It demonstrates the crucial need for effective international intelligence in this changing post-Cold War era. Our intelligence community must monitor the myriad of terrorist groups that may perpetrate violence within our borders or against our citizens. Unfortunately, despite the end of the Cold War, it appears that the list of groups dissatisfied with some U.S. policy is growing, not shrinking, and the vigor and intensity of their opposition may convert traditionally overseas activities into domestic acts of violence. We live in a complex and sometimes confused world. This is only one example of the dangers we live with every day. In addition to effective domestic law enforcement by the FBI and local and state police, let's use all the intelligence resources at our disposal to make certain that this kind of terroristic act does not happen again. And I thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Glickman. We look forward to working with you as not only as a member of this subcommittee, but as Chairman of Intelligence on the areas you brought up. Mr. Sangmeister.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity to speak and for holding this timely hearing. You have done a good job, in my opinion, of preparing at a very short notice a hearing on an issue that may have been overlooked far too long. The bombing of the World Trade Center just over a week ago refocused America's attention on an issue which we have, for the most part, been able to ignore because it always seemed to have happened somewhere else, but not this time. This car bomb went off on our own shores, where we have been lulled into believing things like this do not happen. While many questions still remain unanswered, it appears terrorism has come to America. As we all agree, the prospect that it may happen again is certainly chilling. The Trade Center bombing points out many issues which this subcommittee and full committee must address. First and most importantly, are we safe here in America? Traditionally, terrorism happens in other countries, not here. But now it is New York. We are used to metal detectors and police dogs here on Capitol Hill, but not elsewhere, not in Chicago or Houston or New York. It will not be acceptable for Americans to be forced to live with the fear that any car or truck could be a bomb or that any stranger could be a terrorist. Of course, our immigration policies must be examined. Mohammed Salameh, the first man arrested for this crime, came to the United States in 1987 with a 5-year visa and has been living here illegally since it expired last year. Worst, his alleged mentor, Sheikh Omar Abdul Rahman, was able to enter the U.S. even though he was on a government watch list of people who should not be given visas. Mr. Chairman, it appears your long-standing concern with the ability of illegal aliens to arrive at JFK International Airport and then disappear into the city because the INS does not have the facilities to detain or deport them needs to be addressed. Even the press has become involved. New York Newsday apparently forced the FBI to arrest Salameh prematurely by deciding to run a story that would have tipped him off that the FBI knew about the rental truck that carried the bomb. We can only guess how much shorter and fruitful this investigation could have been if the FBI had been able to trail him for several days as they had originally planned. Speaking of which, I would like to congratulate the FBI, the New York City Police Department, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms on their early success in this investigation. Good police work and good luck have given you a decided advantage in solving this crime. I hope you keep the momentum going and will have all of the people involved in this attack incarcerated as soon as possible. This country and this Congress spend a great deal of time trying to balance individual freedoms with the needs of civil society. This one bomb has now upset that balance on issues from immigration to freedom of the press, speech, and religion. Most importantly, I fear the people we are here to work for no longer feel as secure as they once did. It will be very difficult to restore this balance and, more importantly, to ensure that Americans once again feel safe here at home. And that, I believe, is the most important job before us. And I look forward to working with the subcommittee and the committee to restore that balance and trust. And I'm interested in hearing from the witnesses before us and how that may be done. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sangmeister. Mr. Smith, would you like to make an opening statement?
Is this on? Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll add my thanks to the individuals who have preceded me today as far as the effort you're making to bring this subject to the attention of so many people. Obviously, there's a lot of interest, a lot of public interest in this particular terrorist action that occurred in New York. A couple of comments. First of all, I want to give a special welcome to a longtime friend from San Antonio who's done such an outstanding job in bringing this terrorist into the hands of the law enforcement officials, and that's Bill Sessions. I started to say judge, I should say director, and appreciate his presence here very, very much. The other point I want to make, Mr. Chairman, is that we can give a lot of time and a lot of words to this terrorist action, but unless we come up with specific suggestions as to how to prevent this in the future, this committee, in my judgment, will not have really done its job. And I'm particularly interested, and I know you are too, both because of what you've said publicly and because of legislation that you've introduced, in preventing individuals from coming into this country who should not be admitted to this country. And we have a situation in New York, particularly at JFK International Airport, where all you have to do is arrive in New York and you're in this country, whether you're a terrorist or some other type of individual that should not be admitted. And in fact, the individual thought to have been responsible for this bombing should not have been in this country. And I think part of the solution is going to come down to better enforcing our immigration laws and giving the INS the personnel and the money they need to enforce the laws that are already in effect. We'll find out as a result of today's hearing whether we need more federal laws or not. My guess is we simply need to enforce better the laws that we already have. And to the extent, Mr. Chairman, that you're willing to help prevent individuals from coming into this country that under our current laws should not be admitted, and to the extent that you want to stop the flow of illegal aliens into this country, and to the extent that we want to stop individuals from being able to basically have an open border at JFK Airport, I look forward to helping you in that endeavor.
Well, thank you, Mr. Smith. And you were most helpful last year when we moved our legislation. As you knew, it went through the House, but no further on the airports area anyway. Mr. Washington.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I join my colleagues in commending you for your forthrightness in moving expeditiously so that we could hold these hearings. I don't have a prepared statement, but in view of the record and where we are, I think there are several things that ought to be at least put out in the public agenda for thoughtful people to consider. Much of what I've read in the newspaper recently reminds me of that children's story, Alice in Wonderland, where time that I checked, attending a church where someone who may have views that are different from ours was not a federal offense. And as long as I'm a member of Congress, it never will be an offense. The problem here is prejudgment. And the reason it's important that leaders must lead right now is because through inadvertence on our part, we are likely to say and do things that give people out in the hinterlands the view that it's all right to go ahead and attack people, to go down to the mosque and burn it, to attack people because they have dark hair and a nose that makes them look like perhaps they're Arabs. That's wrong. We don't know who did this dastardly deed, but we're going to find out. And when we find out, if the Congress needs to act to amend our laws in such a way as to tighten the wicket by which people come into this country, then we can do it then. But it seems to me a bit precipitous that we would have the gall to try to determine beforehand what is wrong and what laws we need to change. And I mean that is no disrespect to anyone. Every member of Congress has the same basis upon which we operate. None of us elect each other. There's not another member of Congress who lives in my district, nor I in theirs, and they have the right to do whatever they wish. But it seems to me that as leaders, there ought to be another signal that we also send. We ought to send a strong plea for law enforcement. That's what many of my colleagues are doing here today, and that's altogether appropriate, and we should do it. On the other hand, we also must send a message to the people out there who are watching television or who read newspapers, who would, because they have some problems with their own identity, start to put pieces together that we haven't put together, who would think that there is a jihad going on in this country and it's all right for us to go out as American citizens and be prejudiced against people who come from another country, who are of different faiths than us, who look different than us, because we somehow associate all of these people together. Because that's what prejudgment is. It's lumping people together because they have some common characteristics, whether it's blonde hair or blue eyes or a common ethnicity, and assuming that because one is alleged to have done something, that they're all guilty. The message that we as members of Congress and leaders of our people, it seems to me, ought to be sending out is that that is not so. And as Americans, the last thing we want to do is to be guilty of prejudging other people. And the first thing that we want to do is make sure that the resources, the law enforcement resources are available so that whomever individuals were involved in this are brought to justice and that they get a fair trial in this country. I don't even know whether this fits the definition of terrorism yet. As I understand the definition of terrorism, it has to do with the motive of the incident. Now, these men may know, and I would join my friend from New Mexico in suggesting that we not ask that question, and I'm not going to ask it in this forum. They may know of the motive of the individual who's in custody. They may not know. But it would be altogether inappropriate for us to inquire about that at this time. It seems to me that we ought to first get to the bottom of what happened, how it happened, and who was involved, and let the law enforcement officials present that to a grand jury, and let there be a trial on the merits of those matters and those allegations, because whomever was involved is still entitled to the presumption of innocence under our law. America is a great country, and we don't change our laws because people who don't agree with our laws, who differ with the way that we do business, the time-honored method by which we have chosen to come forward as a democracy for over 200 years has served us well. And it seems to me that if we allow this incident, dastardly deed that it was, to make us destroy the presumption of innocence, not for just these individuals, but for all individuals who are brought before a court of justice and charged with a criminal offense in our society, then the greater harm would have been done to our Constitution. And it seems to me that, as I recall, someone said that no mob has ever protected any liberty, not even its own. And we're not going to be a mob here today. We're going to ask, I hope, probing questions to get information. This is not a trial. This is not the forum at which we ought to make the ultimate determination as to what happened. And as I say, I'm certain that I'd like to hear from my friend from Texas as to the circumstantial evidence that has been gathered so far, but based upon what I've read in the newspaper and based upon the cumulative wisdom of 20 years at the bar trying criminal cases, there's a great leap of faith between what information has been published or uttered in the public arena and going to convict someone because he attended a mosque where someone else was, some blind guy was a preacher. Come on now. This is the United States of America, and this is not going to happen, even on behalf of people who are elected to public office and who must necessarily respond to the public pressure that is justifiably being brought upon us at this time. Mr. Chairman, I'm here, but I'm here to remind my friends and colleagues on the committee that our responsibility, as I understand it, is not to try this case and not to assist the media in trying the case. And based upon some of the statements that I've heard here today, I would counsel all of my colleagues, who of course are all lawyers, to be judicious in our statements, as the gentleman from New Mexico has said, but also to be judicious in the judgments that we make about what actually happened when we don't have the facts. and I thank the chairman for the time.
I thank the gentleman, and as both members of the majority and minority have said, the purpose here today is not to examine the specifics of this case, and in fact the chair will not entertain those kinds of questions. This is a more general issue. This is the first of a series of hearings to determine the general societal issues that this unfortunate incident has brought about. Nothing here should indicate that we're trying to try the case, and that's what I said, Mr. Sensenbrenner said, and I think everybody else said in the opening statements. The gentleman's admonition, though, is of course welcome and underscores just what we're trying to do here. Mr. Geekus.
Yes, I thank the chair. I agree with the gentleman from Washington that we are not in the business here of attaching blame at this point. The only thing that is certain is that 5 people were killed, 1,000 people injured, countless millions of dollars of damage inflicted upon the complex, and so those facts are indisputable, and we have to deal with those, and they're the starting basis for the debate that is yet to come. The prosecution is eventually going to charge X, Y, and Z or more with certain crimes. Already, some of the charges indicate that there is no question that there would be federal jurisdiction and coexistent state jurisdiction wherever that may apply. Insofar as the federal jurisdiction is concerned, then we will have the duty to fill in when we can, if we can, to see what alternatives we can apply even to the present case, even though we might face a situation in which we might have to do something retroactively. But in doing that, I think the gentleman from Washington knows what I'm leading to, and that is that this is the kind of a case with the 5 deaths and the sheer terror and horror of the act that calls for the application in a due time with due evidence adduced to apply the death penalty in this kind of situation. Now, we know that there are tremendous problems, constitutional questions raised, etc., particularly on what I've just touched upon, retroactivity. However, there is, and I want our colleagues to recognize this as we proceed along the debate, because I'm very insistent upon delving into this fully. There is a possibility that under the rulings in Profit versus Florida that did impose the death penalty after the Supreme Court had struck down generally the death penalty, and then several states revived them pursuant to the Furman admonitions, that in the Profit case, a killing took place after the court had struck down the death penalty, and then Florida, the killing took place, and then Florida enacted the guidelines which many of us have been seeking for a generation here in the Congress to apply to a death penalty situation. And the Supreme Court refused to hear the case and thus confirmed the propriety of the instituting guidelines to apply to a case so long as the statute applicable has not been repealed. And of course it has not been repealed in the federal jurisdiction. I want to focus on this and to make sure that our witnesses will be giving us information here that will establish the federal nexus, the federal jurisdiction possibilities in this case, as have already been evidenced. But I think for the record of this subcommittee, the establishment of the federal jurisdiction is very important. I have no further comments at this point.
Thank the gentleman. Only again with the same statement I made to Mr. Washington. It's not in our intent here to explore the specifics of this case, which is an ongoing investigation. Last opening statement for Mr. Mann, and I thank the witnesses for their patience.
I have no statement.
I thank Mr. Mann for his patience. Okay, let's begin with the first panel. Where's the introduction here? Okay, will Mr. Kelly and Mr. Brezhnev please come forward? Commissioner Kelly and Mr. Brezhnev. We're very pleased today to have with us as our first panel 2 of the New York City officials who have been most directly involved in dealing with this crisis. Police Commissioner Raymond Kelly, appointed in 1992, has a distinguished career with the New York City Police Department spanning 32 years. His many assignments throughout the department include service with the Crime Prevention Section and the Emergency Services Unit, in addition to command of the Special Operations Division. Mr. Brezhnev has also had a long career with the City of New York. Before being appointed Executive Director of the Port Authority, which for those of you out of town has jurisdiction over these two buildings, he was first Deputy Mayor of New York City and Deputy Mayor for Operations. In these posts, he oversaw the day-to-day operations of the city agencies that deliver, among other services, transportation and health, police and fire protection. Gentlemen, we realize each of you is extremely busy with the terrible crisis and the normal demands of your duty, and so we very much appreciate your being down here to take time to be with us today. We look forward to your comments. Commissioner Kelly, you may begin. Before you do, I'd ask unanimous consent. The Mayor of New York City had hoped to be here, could not. I ask unanimous consent that his statement be written into the record without objection. Commissioner Kelly, your entire statement will also be added into the record, and you may proceed as you wish.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. Mayor Dankins, as you said, was to be here this morning. Unfortunately, he was not able to. He conveys his regrets that he is not able to testify today. However, as you said, Mr. Chairman, the Mayor has prepared testimony, a copy of which I will submit for the record. On behalf of the New York City Police Department, I want to thank you for giving me the opportunity to testify today about the bombing at the World Trade Center. I am also the Emergency Management Coordinator for the City of New York, and I'm also your witness in that capacity as well. As you know, the World Trade Center includes two of the tallest office buildings in the world. Up until February 26th, approximately 90,000 people worked and visited there every weekday. At least 5 of them were killed as a result of the bombing. 1,000 more were injured, and the lives of tens of thousands more were severely disrupted. Estimates vary, but the losses incurred by businesses and individuals at the World Trade Center are in the neighborhood of $1 billion. The World Trade Center bombing was the largest such attack experienced within the borders of the United States. As such, it has implications far beyond the New York metropolitan area. It has implications that Congress certainly will want to address. But before I touch on that, let me tell you what happened, how the police department and other agencies responded to the immediate emergency, and how our joint investigation with the FBI and other federal agencies is going forward. On Friday, February 26th at 12:18 p.m., an explosion ripped through 6 underground parking levels of the World Trade Center located immediately underneath the Vista Hotel and between the 2 Twin Towers. Within minutes of the explosion, the street in front of the World Trade Center was filled with responding emergency equipment from the New York City Police Department, the New York City Fire Department, Emergency Medical Service, and of course, the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, which owns the center. As hundreds of victims suffered from smoke inhalation streamed out of the Twin Towers and the Vista Hotel, emergency equipment and personnel were already on hand to treat them at the scene or to evacuate them to nearby hospitals. Over 450 people were sent to area hospitals. Another 170 were treated at the scene. 400 more walked into nearby hospitals on their own. 4 New York City Police Department helicopters made 40 rooftop landings on Towers 1 and 2 of the World Trade Center between 12:30 p.m. and 11 p.m. During these first flights, 25 New York City police officers rappelled from helicopters to the roofs of Tower 1, where a landing zone was established and where immediate search and rescue efforts were launched. Fighting high winds at nightfall, police department pilots delivered a total of 125 rescue personnel to the roofs. Over 30 people were evacuated to safety aboard the helicopters. On the ground, we established a temporary headquarters across from the World Trade Center at West and Liberty Streets. We established a temporary landing zone at West and Vesey Streets and a temporary laboratory at the Police Academy. A host of police, fire, and EMS equipment was deployed, including mobile light generators, gasoline and diesel refueling trucks, large electrical generators, decontamination vehicles, 125 ambulances, and 119 pieces of firefighting apparatus. Uniformed officers from our police task forces scattered throughout the 5 boroughs were mobilized and brought to bear in the emergency. In all, 2,000 police, fire, and EMS personnel were on the scene. The search of the Twin Towers and the Vista Hotel by police, fire, and Port Authority personnel began immediately and continued through the night. Between 9:30 p.m. and 2:50 a.m., both towers of the World Trade Center were searched for a second time, floor by floor, to make certain no one was left behind. The Fire Department and Port Authority personnel searched the first 50 floors of the Twin Towers, and the Police Department searched from the 51st floor to the roofs. While search and rescue was still underway, a simultaneous turning of our attentions to the blast site took place. Working with agents of the FBI and ATF, here is what we found. You can see the chart. The explosion took place on the B2 level of the underground garage. The blast was so strong that it produced a crater 6 stories deep and about 200 feet wide. The explosion penetrated upward to the B1 level, to the Street 1 level here, where it punched a hole in the lobby of the Vista Hotel. It blasted downward another 4 levels, taking out the World Trade Center's communication system and other vital equipment. Now, the second chart is an illustration that shows the fact that while vertical supports in the blast area were still standing, the lateral supports had been, in fact, blown away. And that's what made the area of the blast so unstable and hazardous for search parties and investigators. When you look at the blast area, it's hard to take it all in. One car was so flattened that it appeared to be one-dimensional. And here is some of what we saw. We just have slides which we'll run through quickly. Just shows you the scope of the immediate response. Next slide, please. Again, this is West Street looking north, and traffic, as of this day, is still blocked from going north on West Street. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Now, that is the first floor of the Vista Hotel. That's the hole that was punched through the floor of the Vista in the ballroom. Next slide, please. You can see this is what the first responders encountered, a large volume of water and smoke. Next slide, please. Again, this is coming down a ramp from West Street. This is what you see immediately as you turn the corner on the ramp. So some of the cars that were near the blast site, you can see the car turned totally upside down, and all the rubber had burned off that car, and that the heat in the immediate vicinity of the explosion. You can see this illustrates the chart that we spoke about before, that the floor is totally gone, therefore the beams are unsupported. Again, that illustrates the fact that the floor, that is the B2 level, and goes down to the B3 level, that's just simply not there. Again, another car close to the bomb site. Now, what this illustrates, I'm told by bomb experts, is the speed of the explosion, because you can see the rubber on this car was not burned. So apparently there's some indication as to the speed of the explosives, and it gives some indicators to our technicians. Again, this is looking down into the B3 level from the B2 level. Again, showing that the beams are unsupported. This just shows the hazardous conditions that still exist now for workers at the site. The walls have collapsed, and of course there's a shoring up process that's ongoing, but we had to suspend operations as a result of cinder blocks such as this and walls such as this falling down. Next slide, please. That's it? Okay. You can see in the pictures of these twisted wrecks that a tremendous amount of heat was produced at the center of the blast, and the heat was one of the factors that led us to the conclusion early on that a bomb had been exploded. The chassis of a van used in the blast was blown away from the center of the crater. It contained the partial vehicle identification number that eventually led to the arrest of Mohammed Salameh at a truck rental agency in New Jersey. From the pictures, you can get a good idea of how the vertical beams, as you said, were left without any lateral support, and workers are now welding lateral supports in place so that we can go forward with our search for evidence for the missing employee, Wilfredo Mercado, Jr. The successes in the investigation to date stem directly in my judgment, from the fact that the New York City Police Department and the Federal Bureau of Investigation have a long working relationship. Our joint bank robbery task force was the first cooperative effort in the nation and remains a national model. Our joint terrorist task force is now 13 years old, and we work cooperatively every day of the year. We share resources. The police department uses the expertise and assistance of the FBI, ATF, and other federal agencies, and they in turn can borrow the expertise of the New York City Police Department's own intelligence division, our arson explosion squad, and of course the bomb squad, which is the nation's largest and oldest, dating back to 1903. The cooperative relationship is such that over 100 New York City detectives are assigned to various joint efforts with federal law enforcement agencies. I would suggest that the tremendous resources being brought to bear in the World Trade Center investigation, both city and federal, will result in such significant costs that the Congress may want to consider defraying them as an investment in the nation's security. As Police Commissioner, I certainly welcome the Chairman's efforts to seek legislation to strengthen the federal role in combating terrorism. Certainly anything that can help us prevent a single terrorist act from occurring or in apprehending those responsible merits serious examination by Congress. While obviously we would never welcome such attacks, we know that in New York City we are prepared to deal with them. Anyone contemplating such an act should know that the best law enforcement personnel in the world will be on their case for as long as it takes. We are in the business of tracking down killers and locking them up, and we don't forget. New York City will never forget. Again, on behalf of the New York City Police Department, I want to thank you for this opportunity to testify. I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Commissioner. Mr. Bresnaw.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, Congressman Nadler, in whose district the World Trade Center is located. I regret having to appear before you today under such tragic circumstances. 4 of the 5 people who were killed are Port Authority employees. The 5th was a visitor to the Trade Center, and a 6th person working for the Vista Hotel is still missing. But I welcome your invitation to share my perspective on this terrible incident, and more importantly, on the search for lessons that can help us to minimize the chances of such attacks anywhere in America in the years ahead. A primary focus for us since the blast has been to locate Mr. William Mercado, who is still listed as missing. Together with federal, state, and local authorities and specially trained canine rescue squads, we have aggressively searched every area that is structurally safe, but as yet have not located him. These efforts will continue, and as heavy equipment is moved in to remove major slabs of concrete, we plan to move into those areas as soon as possible. Before describing what happened on Friday from the perspective of someone who was there, I was in the tower and was evacuated ultimately with thousands of others who tenant the 2 towers. I want to emphasize the World Trade Center complex will soon be fully operational, demonstrating in the most direct way that we will not be defeated by terrorism. As we meet today, 4 of the 7 buildings of the World Trade Center complex are operational. The vital commodity exchanges have been operating since last Monday with concurrence from the New York City Fire Department. Our PATH rapid transit system also resumed operations into the World Trade Center terminal that same Monday morning. And PATH handles 200,000 daily riders. Most subway operations back into the complex also resumed last Monday. Most major building mechanical and life safety systems have been restored and successfully tested. Structural steel bracing has been installed and debris removal will begin shortly. We are on schedule in moving toward reopening of the Twin Towers. We have been working around the clock and expect that no later than April 1st, we will begin the phased move back, and with some luck and continued hard work, we can shave a number of days off of that date. Commissioner Kelly has described, and you've seen some slides of the damage that has been done. I have additional stills in the corner there that I thought, as a representative, in a representative way, would describe the magnitude of the damage done by the explosion. The explosion was on the second sublevel of the World Trade Center known as B2. This is a public parking level underneath the northern end of the Vista International Hotel. The blast ripped upward. What you see here now are the ramps in the garage on B2 level. And if you move those, Paul, there'll be two different shots of those ramps, and then looking down into the crater. The force of the blast blew downward in an ever-widening circle and compressed 3 levels of concrete slab on top of each other. The force of the blast exploded outward and blew down a wall over the Path Railroad concourse, which is located at the B3 level, sending debris cascading down on turnstiles, escalators, and the platform below on the B4 level. The blast also destroyed the concrete block walls of 5 tower elevator shafts, creating a flue for smoke migration up through Tower 1. The major The loss of life occurred in 2 locations. One victim was in the vicinity of the blast site. I think you can see some of the offices if you move to one of the next. I think there in the background are the office areas. One victim was in the vicinity of the parking lot. 4 other victims, all of the Port Authority employees, were in a lunchroom on the B2 level directly in the path of the blast. The initial blast took out our main power source, our police area, and the operations control center, which is out near the truck dock. And that housed our main communications capability, our alarm monitoring capacity, and security central control. We immediately lost the ability to communicate with tenants throughout the complex or to institute our pre-planned emergency evacuation procedures. Both our police desk and away from that, our operations desk were both knocked out. The emergency generator, which is located in a different area and provides our backup power, kicked in for a brief period of time before shutting down due to 2 factors. Ultimately, the unavailability of water cooling to its engines because all of the pipes throughout the subgrade area were blown out, and because of the appearance of 1.8 million gallons of water flooding the operations control board. Those 2 factors would have rendered our backup redundant system inoperable. Ironically, 3 primary power feeds, even with the magnitude of this blast, were still operating, but we had to shut them down in order for the fire department to extinguish the fire. Minutes after the explosion, staff began to determine the nature and extent of damage to the complex, and I want to stress a couple of points now. The tower buildings, the 2 towers, stood tall. The structural steel supports that frame these 110-story buildings all rest in bedrock. They were not compromised at all. The concrete slab parking levels in the blast area were totally destroyed and collapsed, thus removing horizontal support to several steel columns under the Vista Hotel, which I think you can see there. These columns have been braced. Commissioner Kelly showed you some of that area in the slides to provide structural stability to the Vista and allow the criminal investigation to proceed. The major systems of the complex are being examined, and the majority have been returned to use. Steam heat was returned, communications to the elevators have been restored, generators have been tested, and so on. Obviously, the major concern for reoccupancy is the ability to provide life safety systems. These systems must be operative before the buildings can be occupied. I should note that as part of a $500 million modernization program which was currently underway, even prior to the blast, We were already in the design phase of a decentralized communication and operation system that had been worked out by the New York City Fire Department. That was scheduled for completion before the end of 1995. Obviously, in light of what occurred, we are going to seek prudently to accelerate this project. And for the short term, we've ordered some interim things: battery-powered lighting as a third power source for our stairwells, and a number of other things that we will be working out with the fire department. An issue that has attracted a great deal of attention is the degree to which the Port Authority took precautions against possible attacks at the complex. This, in fact, has been a concern of the agency through the years, and the choices made by the Port Authority's leadership have been consistent with the function of the Trade Center and the practices prevalent in similar high-visibility structures. A report in 1985 and another in 1986 included a recommendation for the removal of underground public parking as a possible precaution. These recommendations, quite frankly, were rejected by management at the time, reasoning, we believe validly, that a World Trade complex offering tenant services, tourist attractions, shopping, restaurants, and entertainment must also offer parking. In fact, hundreds, even thousands of buildings in the city and across the country do in fact offer public parking. In 1991, prior to and during the Gulf War, safety and security issues at all of our land, sea, and air facilities were re-examined, and certain security measures were put in place. We did not eliminate public parking at that time as well. Obviously, we need now to consider at the Trade Center and in the nation what last month's blast means for our society. Without doubt, it created a new benchmark for security. On our part, we will repair structures and systems and restore tenant occupancy at the complex with an awareness of these new conditions. Every decision made about subgrade parking, for example, and other security-sensitive issues is being revisited in cooperation with appropriate authorities. But let me stress this. The World Trade Center was designed to be a crossroads, not a fortress. We, along with other operators of major business and tourist complex, must maintain free and open access to our facilities while providing adequate and necessary security to our tenants and patrons. Tenants returning to our building will see many differences. Among the many improvements will be battery-packed lighting and fire safety trained personnel as an additional redundancy to what existed even before this incident. I would be remiss if I did not use this forum to thank all who came to our aid during this terrible incident. The New York City Police, Fire and Emergency Service units, our own Port Authority police, the hundreds of federal, state, and local law enforcement officials who were able to crack the case in less than a week, the thousands of employees and tenants whose brave actions during the evacuation served as a reminder to the entire nation of the tenacity of New Yorkers. I welcome your questions and realize that any information we gain by reviewing this event and steps that led up to it may help avert such a tragedy in the future. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mr. Bresinoff and Commissioner Kelly. And again, we appreciate your being here. Just first, a quick one to Mr. Bresinoff. You mentioned that, of course, many of my constituents work in the World Trade Center, and all of us in the New York area are concerned. You mentioned that the April 1st deadline, you're quite certain now, would be met, knock wood. The record will show Mr. Bresinoff knocking the wooden table. But you said it might be a little sooner than that. Could you give us a little feel for that? Because we're all on tenterhooks and we're worried about people moving out of the Trade Center, et cetera.
Yeah, let me say that I have not heard from a single tenant any interest in not returning to the World Trade Center. That Fiduciary Trust, a large investment banking and asset management organization, one of the largest tenants in the World Trade Center, reaffirmed its intention to sign a new lease for expanded space only last week. We also signed a lease with a new restaurant for the World Trade Center. We will be doing a number of things to ameliorate the problems that our tenants are facing in this interim period and to offer them assistance and incentives as they return to the Trade Center. There are two towers, as you know. The one that was most seriously affected was number one, the one where my own office is. That will take a little bit longer to clean. I believe that we will be able to shave days from the April 1 deadline, or D-Day as we've established it, for Tower 2, the B tower. I'm reasonably confident that we'll be able to do that, though I will stress that we meet at about 7 a.m. every morning and go over the last 12 hours of construction activity. It is still a crime scene. We must defer and will defer to the investigative authorities as they go forward with their activities. New problems emerge. Thus far, through the dedication of Port Authority personnel and staff, we've been able to cope with those problems, and we're ahead of schedule.
Thank you. Commissioner Kelly, I guess, other than such obvious incidents as the LaGuardia bombing a while back, to what extent in recent years has the New York Police Department seen less dramatic acts of violence that you would qualify as terrorist, in the sense that the violence was politically, possibly religiously motivated? If so, could you tell us something about the perpetrators and NYPD's approach to dealing with this type of violence? I guess the question on the minds of most people is, in New York and elsewhere, are you concerned that this may be the first of a series of such incidents, and what steps are being taken to deal with that, if it's a possibility?
Well, obviously we're concerned about the possibility of being a first in a series. I would say to you that, as I mentioned in my prepared remarks, we have had the Joint Terrorist Task Force in existence for 13 years. I think they have done an outstanding job. A lot of things that, quite frankly, I'm not at liberty to discuss here. But there has been a fair number of investigations, surveillance conducted, and I think their good work has perhaps forestalled or limited the possibility of acts might be loosely referred to as terrorist acts from taking place. I'd say that is the vehicle that we have that has proven to be effective, and if anything, I think we'll just buttress that whole structure that we have now.
Have you seen an increase in attempted incidents, attempted acts like this in the last few years, or has it been relatively flat, and then all of a sudden this one incident occurred?
No, it's hard to characterize. I would say relatively flat, though, if I had to make a choice.
Mm-hmm. And let me ask you this, because this is a question I hear a lot of New Yorkers just on the streets debating, and that is, it seems, at least from the evidence that we've seen, that the group that did this was not one of these professional terrorist groups, such as perhaps the one behind the Pan Am bombing, Flight 103, that it was more, amateur would be the wrong word, but a less repeated, less polished operation. They didn't use sophisticated explosives, etc. And I guess the question I have, is that fair to say, and does that indicate that we should be, some people say we should be less worried, because this is not the most professional group in the world and struck once. On the other hand, people say we should be more worried. It indicates that it doesn't take the tremendous amount of skill and planning and years of training to pull off one of these terrible incidents. Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
I don't
for
think
us,
I'm in a
please?
position to characterize this event as sophisticated or less than sophisticated. I think it's too early in the investigation to say that. I think it's general knowledge that there is a lot of information abroad out there that people can gather if they want to make explosive devices. That's just the state of the world in 1993. But I don't know at this juncture whether or not we can say this is a sophisticated or simple device.
Right. What do you think, using your experience as commissioner, of the idea of putting these taggants in all explosives. Would that help you in not only this particular case, but in other cases like it? And would it impede any of the commercial activities that go on by people who use explosives legitimately?
Right. Our bomb people think it's an excellent idea. I know it's been endorsed by the International Association of Bomb Technicians. So as far as impeding in the commercial area, I think just a reasonable approach will take care of most of that. But the people in the bomb investigative community, to the best of my knowledge, wholeheartedly support that concept.
Okay. Let me ask you this, Mr. Brezhnev, and again, you've underscored, and I think well put, that the World Trade Center is a commercial building, not a castle or a military type of institution. But what useful and inexpensive changes can be made to potential targets like this, which will make them less vulnerable to acts? I mean, what would you recommend to people who are going through the mental exercise that unfortunately you are going through in reality?
This is still midstream, as it were. But first, on the safety management side, having two levels of redundancy in some respects clearly are not enough. We have water-cooled emergency generators. The system was put together in anticipation of a power outage, a blackout, a fire of some kind, not a bomb blast. I think we will have to give every consideration to having another level of emergency generation that is air-cooled.
It's a third level.
Which, of course, raises questions of fuel storage. I mean, there is no free lunch here, but I feel pretty confident that we're going to come out. We already have a review underway, looking for an air-cooled emergency generation plant that will at least handle basic systems and supplement the extensive emergency generation plant that we now have. We are looking to have, we were already in process of establishing decentralized communications operations centers. That too is an important thing to have, and I'm going to try and accelerate that capital project. It was begun about 1.5 years ago. Third, I think that my own experience was that the most terrible thing that we faced was not knowing what was going on. That in truth, everyone in the towers was safe, but the police, the fire department, no one could get us information to tell us we were safe, and that the best thing that we could do was to wait in our offices, which ultimately we did for lack of a realistic choice at the time. Having redundant communication systems of various kinds, I think, is extremely important for high-rise buildings. And we are going to be, we already have begun to look at FM systems. They have to be controlled because in an emergency, you can get overload. And the transmissions either won't come through or you won't be able to figure out who's talking to whom. But redundant communication systems, if we had had those, the evacuation would have been a very different matter. So we've learned that as well. As for the more security-sensitive issues, I have to tell you that if somebody had asked me the question 6 months ago, do you think that you should eliminate or sharply restrict public parking at the World Trade Center or any of the other major public buildings in New York City, I would have said no. Everything's on the table now. I'm not saying that we will conclude that we should eliminate public parking, but I am saying that we're going to look very hard at that issue and issues like it, access to our subgrades, and how, even as they continue, if they continue, how they will be delimited. It is a difficult balance. This is a crossroads, the World Trade Center, but I think with the help of law enforcement officials, government officials, and outside expertise, we will have to tilt the balance a little. Not happy about it, but I think it's clearly called for.
Two final questions to the Commissioner. First is, what else have you thought about in terms of restricting, if at all, the availability of explosives in terms of dealing with this new threat? Second, and this is a specific one, there were reports that warnings were received from a Palestinian terrorist group that a bomb would be planted in a New York City skyscraper in January unless the 400 Palestinians deported from Israel in December were allowed to return. Was it treated as a credible threat? If so, was New York City on a heightened security alert at the time of the bombing? So the first question on explosives, the second one here.
I think we have to use a lot of common sense as far as restrictions on explosives. Obviously, they're used for commercial purposes, and I'm not able to give you a quick answer, but I think a lot of it has to be looked at in terms of its impact on business. I've talked to R-bomb technicians, R-bomb experts, and they're very much aware, very much sensitive to the fact that a lot of explosives are used every day legitimately and are necessary. So I think a lot of staff work has to be done before we come out and say what we're going to limit or what we're going to restrict. As far as the threat in January, yes, there was a threat that was received. It was it said on words to the effect that unless the Palestinians were accepted back in, or the people that Israel had ejected were accepted back in by Israel, I believe the threat was received, let's say on the 22nd of January, that by the 24th of January there would be a bombing in New York City. Nothing more specific than that. We did go on a heightened state of readiness in the sense that we notified the missions. As you know, we have over 100 missions to the United Nations in New York City. Certainly the Israeli mission was notified. Additional security was put in place. The explosion was to take place by January 24th. There was a subsequent message that extended that time to January 26th. It was a self-limiting notification. After that period of time, somewhat after that period of time, it was, in essence, a stand down as far as that notification was concerned. But we did take it seriously. We did notify certainly people that we believe to be at risk.
There's unfortunately an eerie similarity, and I take it that that is still, you're still taking those kinds, that message seriously, yes, and relating it. Mr. Sensenbrenner.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Now, I have a couple of real brief questions because there are some other very important witnesses, which I hope we were able to get to in a timely manner. But they're directed toward Mr. Brezhnev. It appears to me from your testimony and that of Commissioner Kelly that this bomb was very well placed, either by accident or by design. It could not have been in a more sensitive area in the parking garage in terms of immobilizing the services that are provided by the World Trade Center. Do you screen employees that are hired to work in the World Trade Center and other major buildings, run them through some kind of a background check with the police department or other security agencies just to make sure that you're not hiring someone who will be snooping around to see where the sensitive points are?
Well, not the, we have 9,000 employees at the Port Authority. Some of our employees do, in fact, go through various kinds of background checks. We also have thousands of contract employees, particularly at the World Trade Center. So I think the fullest answer to your question would be not the kind of background check that your question implies.
Has any consideration been given to issuing badges that would restrict access by employees to certain areas within the World Trade Center?
Well, that in fact is true. Our areas of the World Trade Center where we have our electronic systems, for example, transformers, our power sources and so on, are in fact restricted and have very limited access. The area where this explosion appears to have taken place is purely a public area. It is on a ramp that leads toward an exit from the garage area. that would not be an area that would be at all restricted.
Now, relative to restriction or potential closure of the underground parking garage, I did note before the hearing that there was a security assessment that recommended closing the underground parking garage, which I think was rejected for good reason, because my visits to New York are few and far between, but the parking is atrocious, you know, no matter where you are in the city, and taking away that number of spaces would make it even worse. Having said that,
the subway, Jim.
do you have a suit of armor for me for that? The question that I want to ask relative to that is, it seems to me that there is kind of a medium that would not relate to the closing of the parking garage, but would allow for the inspection of vans and trunks of cars and things, places where bombs could perhaps be hidden. Has that ever been considered before now?
It was in the array of alternative possibilities in one of the reports, measures similar to that. As I said, everything's on the table, but one has to think about the nature of the World Trade Center, with its restaurants and shops. Events take place there. Having trunks opened up, would we say that a wrapped box had to be opened? Would we be x-raying boxes? This is a big step. Again, we're going to be in consultation with experts in the field as well as law enforcement officials in thinking about and deciding how to go forward in these areas. But there are a number of elements to weigh here.
Yeah. Have there been any types of gradations of security protections considered, similar to the 4 levels of security at airports in the United States, where if there is information that there's a potential terrorist threat, the FAA or law enforcement can order that the security be heightened, as it was during the Gulf War?
We were in the process of adding closed-circuit TV to the underground garage areas, though that, of course, is as a recorder and as more of a security measure for more typical routine kinds of security security threats. We also have, I should note, the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey has its own police department, and it has a police complement of 40 uniformed police at the World Trade Center and 160 private guards. That is a part of our security operation. But and the public parking area itself is staffed, but there are parts of the garage up to this point where cars can move in and out without being reviewed or inspected.
I have one last quick question of Commissioner Kelly. The reports are that the explosive was 1,000 to 1,500 pounds of dynamite. Can you let us know how much space that amount of dynamite would fill up?
I don't know. Those reports, I think, were just speculation in the press. And we have not, as far as I know, the bomb technicians have not determined the size or the nature of the explosive. It's still out there. They still have not made a determination.
Okay, well, if it was dynamite, how much does 1,000 to 1,500 pounds of dynamite fill up?
I think you could certainly speculate that it would fill up a van.
Thank you.
Mr. Edwards.
No questions.
Mr. Schiff.
Very briefly, just to follow up, gentlemen, on what was just asked by Mr. Sensenbrenner. Commissioner, when the law enforcement authorities believe that they understand the physical nature of this explosive, I believe that we in this subcommittee in the Congress would be very interested in that information, because it then leads to other questions. How easy or difficult is it to access this kind of explosive, to put together this kind of bomb? Because that's a matter that I think we would want to address in legislation similar to what the chairman is offering today. Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Schiff. Mr. Sangmeister.
Well, in the order of brevity, I would like to follow up a little bit on that question. The purpose of this committee, of course, is to see whether any legislation is going to be forthcoming that can be helpful. If you know, maybe you don't know, and I guess this would be addressed to you, Mr. Kelly. If I wanted to buy a stick of dynamite in the state of New York today, you know what I have to go through, or what kind of an inspection is made of my past, or what kind of documents do I have to sign? Do you have any idea what is involved?
No, you need some form of licenses to sell it. I'm not certain what you need to buy it, and there is some sort of recording process. I'm not totally familiar with it, but there is a licensing process to sell it, not necessarily to buy it.
But then you can't really tell us how easily accessible it is to the average individual that may want to buy an explosive.
I mean, we know that there is a fair amount of explosives that disappear. They're used legitimately on construction sites, on demolition sites, and it just no adequate means of recording how much is on a particular site or how much is sold. I mean, it is as far as construction people are concerned, it is a common practice to use some sort of explosive.
But the thing that I would be interested in, of course, we could check that out as well, is it's one thing for construction companies, people that are in the quarry business, obviously having a ready supply of that stuff and it being screened, but I'm just worrying about the average individual. You know, we have a lot of people in this country who think you ought to be able to walk into an arms store and just lay down your cash and walk out with a firearm. Okay? I'm just wondering if that isn't the situation and something we hadn't really thought about, that you could walk in, lay down your cash, and walk out with a stick of dynamite. If so, it's something I think we need to look at.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Geekin.
Yes. I thank the chair. Recently, I read an article a commentary by Mary McGrory of the Washington Post, and is the first time that I've ever read an article by that particular writer in which I agreed 100%. And her article was commendatory of New York and New Yorkers on their swift and compassionate and friendly and neighborhood and altruistic output at the time of this accident. Your testimony today endorses that, confirms it, and expands it, and for that we're grateful, and we add our compliments as profusely as we can do so. The commissioner mentioned, I thought that structural damage, if any could be termed as such, was occasioned as to one beam. No, more than one?
Well, Mr. Brezhnev probably...
Yeah, Mr. Brezhnev, that's why I said, Mr. Brezhnev made it more, a little wider than that.
There are many columns that have been weakened.
Yes.
That illustration just tried to show you the problem with the lack of support on the beams.
Yes.
Even though the beams are standing, they have no lateral support. And that's what's being done now. The shoring up is taking place.
Yeah,
much more than
that's
one.
all I wanted
to
clear
have
up
18 of them shored up, and then
18 of them.
Yes, and then lateral supports are now in the process of being put in to hold those beams in place.
But yet we're quick to emphasize that those only affect the center core underneath the hotel, and therefore do not compromise the integrity of the support mechanisms for the towers. And that's an extremely important fact to get out to the entire community, so that re-access to the twin towers is made available quickly. That's good news. The other, one of you mentioned, I think it was the commissioner, that many of the people who were injured were treated on site. Is there a first aid station or first aid stations interspersed among the tenants in the centers?
Well, we had several medical capabilities within the complex, but the vast preponderance of treatment was afforded by New York City emergency personnel, emergency medical service, who was swiftly on the scene. We have an ambulance on duty at the World Trade Center all the time, attended. We also have a medical office on the 61st floor. Those personnel were available, but this is a good opportunity for me to cite just how exemplary the emergency medical service was in providing service to the affected individuals.
All of that, together with the joint effort of the law enforcement agencies, shines through so brilliantly that that many of us are going to consider, I personally am going to consider this as an incident in the past from which we're going to learn and and then proceed, because New Yorkers, as all Americans, are resilient and eager to meet challenges.
I just wanted to say that the Emergency Medical Service set up a treatment facility in the World Financial Center, which is essentially across the street. So they had a treatment facility on scene that they established.
And how many did you say were treated on site? 100?
About 170, and 450 removed to hospitals, and then another 400 on their own went to area hospitals.
And some were treated locally and just discharged?
Yes. We still have about 13 people remaining in the hospital. We were up to about 50 people who had been admitted to the hospital, and we have still 13 remaining.
What I gather from that is that some of them who were treated on site in that quick facility that was set up were also just let go after a Band-Aid or whatever.
That's right. Yes, sir.
I have no further questions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Geekus. Mr. Washington.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have no questions.
Mr. Mann. Mr. Nadler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, let me express my appreciation to the chairman for inviting me to sit in on this, because though I'm not a member of the subcommittee, the World Trade Center is in my district. And let me also say that I was there about an hour and a half after the explosion. I watched the exemplary performance of the Port Authority personnel and the emergency personnel, the fire and police department and EMS, and it was just spectacular to watch, and gives one a great deal of confidence. I have a couple of questions for Mr. Brezhnev. What is the normal, the dominant thing one heard and saw of the that was hindering the evacuation and giving rise to medical problems, aside from the unfortunate individuals who were in the immediate vicinity of the blast, was the fact that the elevator corridors and the stairwells were filled with smoke? What is the normal precaution or preventative measure that is supposed to stop that from happening?
We have two power sources, and we have fans that can purge smoke. With both power sources being out, that fan system couldn't work. The fire department quickly determined that they could fairly easily extinguish the blaze, and determined that that was the best way to get rid of the smoke and to protect the individuals in the towers. They proceeded to do so. We had to shut off the 3 remaining power feeders so that there was a lot of water down there, and they had to put water on the fire. And that meant that we had no power capacity for any of this at all. So that since the blast was very close to the elevator shafts, in fact, it blew out the pits, the elevator pits in several of the shafts. It was like having I'm not sure if engineers would agree with me, but this is how it appears to me. It's like having a fire in a fireplace and the smoke going up the chimney, going all the way to the top.
So in other words, there were 2 power sources, both of which were knocked out. Would you think that for the future, or if you were building a different building today, or for the future renovation of the trade centers, how would you prevent this from happening in the future? God forbid if there were another emergency.
There are going to be a number of things that I'm going to do to prevent this from happening in the future.
Yeah, period.
We've had, as you know, Congressman, we've had several challenges at the Trade Center. We had the blackout in Lower Manhattan, and our power, we still had lights and so on at the World Trade Center, even when much of the rest of Manhattan was out. We've had some electrical fires and so on, and our backup systems worked perfectly in a way that was what they were designed for. Okay, first, we're in discussion with the fire department to look at new kinds of additional smoke purge systems for our elevators, for our stairwells, for the buildings as a whole. This is a consultation process that is already underway. In fact, it's a good opportunity for me to thank Commissioner Rivera and the department for their assistance, advice, and direction. We're going to do a 3rd power source. I think it will almost certainly be air-cooled generators somewhere. As I mentioned, that carries a little bit of a problem with it. You have to store some fuel, or you have to have access to fuel at some point to keep them operating. One of the issues that gets talked about a lot, it's a fairly complicated issue, is the use of pressurized stairwells. As you know, the World Trade Center was designed 25 years ago, built over 20 years ago, pressurized stairwells. It was decided not to do pressurized stairwells at the time. The fire code of New York City has as an alternative sprinklered buildings or pressurized stairwells. The World Trade Center towers are sprinklered fairly recently, within the last 10 years or so. The fire department and I have been discussing this issue. There's a lot of debate about it. If you open several doors, the pressurization disappears. We are going to retain, with the advice and counsel of the fire department, some outside expertise to once and for all evaluate the use of pressurized stairwells in the towers, and we will abide by where this objective outside expert review comes out. There's a lot of debate about whether it's a good or bad thing to do in the towers. It is possible that when the Trade Center was built, you could have had a stairwell exactly designed that way only for that purpose, or some kind of a flue. That was not the case.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Handler, and thanks for joining us and your interest. I just have two quick final questions. First, Commissioner Kelly, I think that most of us have been very appreciative of the cooperation between the federal and local officials, and knowing how you have made that clear that there was going to be complete cooperation. Could you just inform us as to why the indictment against Mr. Salama was, or the arraignment as well, were done federally rather than in New York State, under New York State law?
I think it clearly fits into the federal statute. We do an awful lot of work in federal court where there is an option. We tend oftentimes to go to the federal courts. Severity of the penalties is one of the considerations. So nothing unusual here. The New York County District Attorney has been involved from the beginning, cross-designated to be
Was it that the federal laws were better and more appropriate? I mean, better is the wrong word. More appropriate for this particular? Was it federal procedures that brought you to the federal courts, federal resources? Obviously, someone had to sit down and make a rational choice about which would be preferable.
Yeah, I think the fact that we had the vehicle, the Joint Terrorist Task Force, was functioning from the get-go, and the fact that their involvement is almost totally with the U.S. U.S. District Court, the attorney for the Southern District of New York, particularly Eastern District. It just was, I think, the appropriate way to go, and we certainly still feel that way. This doesn't preclude, I think, the possibility of the homicide investigation, homicide indictments being done locally. But right now, for the explosion, I think this is certainly the best way to go.
I'll be happy to yield, gentlemen, just for a moment.
Question
sure.
The chair posed. We believe, and we ask you to confirm, that one of the reasons that the federal jurisdiction assumed a role there partially was based on the interstate commerce feature of the World Trade Center itself, the site of the bombing, and the vehicle that could have been used in that kind of circumstance, all under the federal statutes which talk about explosions and explosives in that context.
Interstate, right. If you look at the statute, it's clear. Section 18.
Thank you, Mr. Gigas. And one final question. I know it's not in your jurisdiction, but one of the things that a number of us are concerned about is the airports, the whether we should be doing more in terms of watching who comes here. Do you have concerns about that? Does it occupy a lot of NYPD's time? Kennedy obviously is a gateway from the whole world. What's your view?
Well, I think you said it in your opening remarks, Mr. Chairman. I think it's something that should be examined. There's a lot of anecdotal reports, if you will, of people getting on airplanes outside of the country and actually eating documentation that gets them on a plane. They show up in New York. They have no documentation. They claim asylum, and they're able to stay in the New York area in most cases for an extended period of time. This has caused us problems in the past, and I would just simply recommend that area be examined. I think
stretched your resources to some extent.
Certainly, it stretches our resources in a whole variety of ways. So I think that it is a fruitful area for the committee to look into.
Well, thank you. And I want to thank, in conclusion, both of our witnesses. Both of you and the men and women you represent have really been the silver lining to this cloud. Exemplary performance, showing people and my colleagues from all over the country how New Yorkers can and do pull together in times of crisis. Sometimes we're more civil to each other in times of crisis than we are during the normal course of events. But you both have been, in terms of your leadership under difficult circumstances, and the men and women you represent, a beacon. I thank both of you for coming. Okay, we will now proceed right on to panel 2. Got to get new signs up. Okay, we're very fortunate this morning to have as our second panel today the top federal officials in charge of the World Trade Center investigation and of U.S. domestic counterterrorism strategy and operations. The Honorable William Sessions was appointed Director of the FBI in 1987 after a long and distinguished career as a jurist. He served as Chief Judge for the Western District of Texas and as the United States Attorney for that district. Before that, he was at the Justice Department as Chief of the Government Operations Section, Criminal Division, and in private practice. And he is accompanied by Neil Gallagher. He's Chief of the Counterterrorism Section of the FBI, and I want to personally thank you, as I know our whole panel does, Director Judge Sessions, for being here and being available for our questions before and after this event. You have been right there. We also have joining the Director Wayne Gilbert and Harry Branton, who are senior FBI officials. Also with us from the FBI, of course, is James Fox, the FBI's Assistant Director in charge of New York. I know Mr. Fox well. Have taken some tours of his operation with him, and we in New York are lucky that the FBI has assigned him to our metropolitan area. He has a long service with the FBI, and it's included a post as Special Agent in charge of the Foreign Counterintelligence Soviet Division in the New York City office. We're also joined by Director Stephen Higgins. He was appointed Director of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms in 1983. He's been with ATF 32 years, since 1961. Most of this time he served in management. He's been recognized frequently for his stellar leadership and his outstanding efforts in the war against armed career criminals. And I think the whole panel joins me, Director Higgins, in expressing our deep sorrow over the recent deaths of the 4 ATF agents in Texas. Our prayers are with you. We've been with each other on several occasions since that, and I know how heavily it weighs on you, and it again shows your dedication to the men and women in ATF that you lead. Our hopes are also there, of course, that the situation will be resolved shortly. Director Higgins is accompanied by Charlie Thompson. He's the special agent in charge of the New York field office of ATF, and again, someone I've had a long acquaintanceship with. Also here from ATF is James Brown. He is the chief of the ATF's explosives division. We had a number of questions about explosives, and I don't think we could find a better witness than Mr. Brown. We also have, I guess the order is a little, State and Justice are getting along very well, at least on this panel, because we also have in between the Justice Department witnesses, Ambassador Thomas McNamara. He was named the State Department's U.S. Coordinator for Counterterrorism in 1992. After serving as U.S. Ambassador to Colombia, It was spelled here as the university, but we know it's the country. Sometimes we think the university may need an ambassador too, I guess. He joined the National Security Council. He's also served as the Special Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs, as the State Department Deputy Assistant Secretary for Politico-Military Affairs, and as the National Security Council's Director of Counterterrorism and Narcotics. Well, I want to welcome all of you. Thank you for taking the time away from your many duties to be with us, because the knowledge represented at this table in terms of the area of terrorism, I think, would be virtually unequaled. We're extremely interested, of course, not only to hear an update of the status of the investigation in terms of the general facts you can tell us, as has been mentioned time and time again. We are not here to try anyone, to prejudge anyone, or to impede your investigation by trying to elicit facts from you that would. But also, of course, answer the number of general questions about the possibility of increasing terrorism in the United States, and most importantly of all, what we can do about it here today. Judge Sessions, if you would please begin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I brought before the committee two books, which I think you may have in your materials up there. I hope they're of help to you in understanding both the FBI's counterterrorism program and terrorism generally in the United States and the efforts that are made to deal with it. I regret that such a devastating incident has brought me here today. As you noted, that I'm accompanied by Assistant Director James Fox of the New York's FBI division, the New York division of the FBI. Mr. Fox is an assistant director who is in charge of the investigation of suspected terrorist bombing at the World Trade Center. The FBI, as you know, is the lead federal agency in investigating terrorist acts inside the United States. We have pursued this particular investigation as an act of terrorism from early in the investigation. Accordingly, the FBI has primary federal jurisdiction. Utilizing the concept, as Commissioner Kelly discussed, of a joint terrorism task force, the FBI has worked with and coordinated all aspects of this investigation with the New York City Police Department. Furthermore, the FBI and the New York City Police Department have received invaluable assistance from a wide range of federal and local agencies. Of particular note, of course, is the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, BATF, which has greatly assisted in the crime scene examination. Also of notable assistance have been the New York State Police, the Port Authority Police, the U.S. Secret Service, the Immigration and Naturalization Service, the Department of State Diplomatic Security, and the United States Customs Service. This investigation has been and continues to be a coordinated effort utilizing the full resources of U.S. law enforcement and the entire federal, state, and local communities. Because of the FBI's responsibility, I'd like to make some preliminary comments and then give you a brief overview of our investigation to date. I will also address certain issues that I've heard raised during the course of the investigation. First, I would emphasize that much investigation remains to be done. In many investigations, but particularly in this one, methodical, careful, and often time-consuming investigation and analysis is absolutely required. The FBI, the ATF, the New York Police Department, and all other agencies assisting in the investigation have brought to the investigation literally hundreds of professionals who understand this process. They are working around the clock to solve the bombing and, most importantly, to ensure a successful prosecution. As professional law enforcement officers, we are also keenly aware that disclosure of investigative facts prior to trial could impede the investigation and also adversely affect the prosecution. In this respect, the bombing at the World Trade Center is no different than any other case. Because of this, I am confident that the committee does understand that there are some operational and evidentiary aspects that cannot and will not be discussed. From the public's perspective, I recognize that this case is different. The target of the bombing, the tragic loss of life, the specter of terrorism referred to by the committee members this morning, and the resulting anxiety that has been experienced by some of our fellow citizens. All of these fuel an understandable desire for information to explain this vicious act. I, and I'm confident the rest of my panel members, will be as forthcoming as this operational concern permits. Let me begin by stating firmly that I believe that one effective weapon to deter future acts such as this is to aggressively investigate and successfully prosecute those who are responsible for this cowardly deed. That is our objective, from which we will not waver. The FBI has assigned hundreds of people, including seasoned investigators, forensic and bomb experts, computer specialists and analysts, and many other disciplines that an incident of this magnitude dictates. We are fortunate to have such a wide variety of disciplines and expertise. In addition, we have brought into the mix our long-standing role and experience in dealing worldwide with terrorism. The FBI's participation as an observer at the European Trevi Conference on Terrorism and with international organizations, as well as the long-standing international relationships, give us a unique intelligence base from which to build. Our international presence could prove to be invaluable in this case. All agencies are dedicated to solving the case as quickly as possible. Mr. Chairman, let me give you a brief overview of the major events in this case. What happened initially, of course, at the Trade Center has already been described in detail. The first priority was the safety of all the individuals in the complex, and I would like to take this opportunity to join with others who have expressed it in magnificent terms, commending the men and women, both public and private citizens, who have braved obvious dangers to assist their fellow citizens during the course of this tragedy. Their heroic example stands as a shining testament for all of us. Perhaps even more important, it strikes me as a fitting first response to those who might be testing our resolve to deal with this kind of bombing. Certainly the City of New York, its many agencies and citizens that responded, deserve all the special attention and recognition that we can give them. On that first day, the FBI, the ATF, and the New York City Police Department began the arduous task of securing the scene. The collection of the evidence necessary to determine the cause of the explosion began almost immediately. Experts in explosives, chemicals, and metallurgy from the FBI, ATF, and New York City Police Department were very quickly assembled. The FBI's Rapid Start Team was sent from the FBI headquarters to New York City to provide the computer capability necessary to administer and support a major investigation such as this. In New York City, a task force was quickly formed comprised of FBI agents and the New York City Police Department detectives who were members of the FBI's existing Joint Terrorism Task Force. The task force referred to by Commissioner Kelly, of course, has been in existence for 13 years, and it was immediately supplemented with the experts from numerous other agencies that I've just mentioned. While this necessary organizational work was occurring, the most important focus of the investigation was the scene of the explosion itself. Because of safety factors, it remains very dangerous and very difficult to process that scene and to gather evidence. On Sunday, February 28th, we concluded that we had a sufficient factual base and information to support the forensic conclusion that the explosion had been caused by a bomb. If I might, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to make a point here that's been referred to by several of the committee members. There are many reporters, academics, and private consultants who are reporting their own conclusions with result to certain aspects of this investigation, such as the early report that now seems so obvious that the explosion was caused by a bomb. Much of their dialogue appears to be based on what I would respectfully refer to as educated speculation. Quite frankly, as investigators, we also engage in this type of analysis in order to develop theories and scenarios which might explain the evidence or provide focus and direction for the investigation. It is done internally, and it is done, and though it can be of great assistance in an investigation, it, of course, is not evidence. I make this distinction because I do not believe it is appropriate for me, as the director of the FBI, to publicly speculate or to deal in the rhetoric of possibilities. As a result of the evidence developed in the investigation, on Thursday, March 4th at 10:28 a.m., Mohammed Salema was arrested by members of the Joint Terrorist Task Force. A complaint and affidavit were subsequently filed charging Salema with violations of Title 18 United States Code, Section 844, involving the destruction by fire or explosive of a building used in interstate or foreign commerce. Salema was arraigned before a United States magistrate and is currently being held without bond and without bail pending trial. I believe the subcommittee has a copy of the complaint and the affidavit in support. Because of the pendency of the prosecution, further comment by me, I think, would be inappropriate. To date, there have also been several searches conducted pursuant to court order. While I cannot be more specific at this time, I can say that items of potential evidentiary value have been seized and are currently being examined. During one of those searches on March 5th, 1993, an individual named Ibrahim El Ghabrani engaged in activities which caused him to be arrested and charged with obstruction of justice. He has also been arraigned as being held again without bond pending trial. We continue to aggressively follow where the evidence takes us and will pursue whatever develops from these leads. It is premature to reach any conclusions beyond what has already been discussed. There is still much that we do not know. Since I became director of the FBI in 1987, there have been many complex and difficult investigations. I have always been struck by the amazing ability of our law enforcement agencies to meet those challenges and by the FBI's ability to conduct incredibly complex investigations. This case, of course, is no different. I can assure you that to the extent humanly possible, every relevant avenue is being aggressively explored in our attempt to determine the full scope of the criminal activity which caused this tragedy, and I am confident that it will be solved. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to address two other concerns. First, the FBI's aggressive pursuit of all leads in this investigation does not mean that the seriousness of the offense will be used to justify intrusions into the lives of individuals simply because of their nationality or their religious belief. You have my assurance on that point. Second, since the bombing of the World Trade Center, I've been asked in a number of forums whether this incident could be the beginning of a new wave of terrorism in the United States. In responding to such questions, I quickly point out that such conclusions are speculative at best. The American public should always be vigilant, but this suspected act of terrorism should not be so viewed as an opening act of a coming wave of terror. As the charts over here before you indicate, there have been 163 terrorist incidents recorded in the United States since 1982. There has been a virtual, uninterrupted decline in these incidents since 1982. In addition, the majority of terrorist acts in the United States have been conducted by domestic groups, principally in Puerto Rican by Puerto Rican terrorists. The last international terrorist incident, as was previously referred to, occurred in April 1992, when Iranian oppositionists took over the Iranian mission to the United Nations in New York. Prior to that incident, there had not been an international terrorist attack in the United States since 1983. In any case, terrorism has been and remains a priority investigative program for the FBI. I emphasize that fact not only in recognition of the work the FBI has done in the last several years, but to point out that our commitment of resources and attention to terrorism program has a priority status, and that status remains firm. I certainly appreciate that these numbers may give little solace to the loved ones of the victims of this tragedy, but I want to assure you and all Americans that the FBI will continue to be committed to devoting whatever resources are necessary to address terrorism as well as to resolve this case. Further, I am convinced that the law enforcement and intelligence agencies of this country and around the world will continue to commit ourselves to the fight against terrorism. We must not become hostages in our own country. With this commitment, with the resources at our disposal, and with the continuing support and understanding of the American people, I am confident that we can solve this case and meet tomorrow's challenges as well. I'll be pleased to answer whatever questions the committee has, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Sessions. Director Higgins.
I'd like to thank you, Mr. Chairman, first for your kind words of support and sympathy, and I'll pass those along to people in the agency, but also for calling the hearing because I believe it is appropriate. I'd also like to thank Mr. Washington, though, and others for their comments because they called for restraint, and I think that's also appropriate. Behind the understandable public focus on the search for suspects, there are two factors that ultimately will resolve this tragic event and that demonstrate to the American public that the United States is exceptionally well prepared to respond to such acts. The first of these is the task force operation that has responded to the incident. The response of New York City's public safety officials to the event itself was the beginning. Their organization and ingenuity in the aftermath of the blast has not been credited nearly enough for minimizing injury and loss of life. Commissioner Kelly himself exemplifies how his officers performed with preparation, readiness, and in the face of a massive challenge, a calm sense that they cannot be overwhelmed. We have a personal interest in that bombing as well as professional interest. We have an office in that building, and because of the response of those people, the people that worked in our office were able to get out of the building safely, so we appreciate that on a personal sense as well. Joining in the investigation, the FBI has brought its leadership and experience in anti-terrorist investigations, and ATF its capabilities in the investigation of explosives and bombings. It needs to be clearly understood that there's nothing needed in the investigation that is beyond the capability of the three agencies and those others mentioned here earlier working together. A field laboratory was set up in which forensic analysis was conducted near the scene. Staffed by scientists from the three agencies, this was a unique effort. Early last week, in the devastated area, New York Police Department bomb squad, ATF personnel from the National Response Team, which was called up, and FBI personnel surveyed a situation that has proven as much a challenge in structural engineering as anything else. However, bomb experts knew something important. An explosion like this will rip a vehicle to pieces, but it will move some of those pieces in a predictable pattern. Moreover, one of the most survivable sections of a vehicle will be its frame. That frame will be blown downward into the center. That team lowered an ATF explosives expert down into a 70-foot crater, and that expert found what he was looking for. A piece of the vehicle was recovered with a partial vehicle identification number. That search was a calculated risk given the conditions in that building. However, that VIN number was extrapolated and has proven a major break. That break came because experts in many areas were conducting a broad inquiry down many avenues in full coordination with one another. As dramatic as that break has proven, it would be wrong to categorize this, as some have done, as an investigation which is almost over. In fact, it is in many ways just beginning. The Port Authority has done yeoman duty in helping us shore up that vital blast seat area. However, we still have weeks of simply hard and painstaking work in front of all of us. The blast occurred in a concrete and steel parking area, and while most explosives try to go in a 360-degree pattern, the structure interfered with that. This created a maelstrom in which evidence and debris ricocheted around. The damage to vehicles around the blast was huge. The scene is physically large and disturbed. Much of that can be overcome by careful search and forensic work. Each piece that is found must be documented and carefully accounted for. The goal of that effort is not only to find, identify, and reconstruct the device to identify who is responsible. That goal is to do so in a tight framework of evidence that will lead to a conviction of the person or persons involved. The work we are doing with our counterparts on the scene complements the investigative efforts. To assist in this, we have sent in a second national response team to work with the one already on site. This careful, patient, persistent work goes on with a careful eye to the condition of the structure in which we're all working. This second team will help speed the work only through the number of hours we can work, and we're willing to work as much as necessary. It's really, though, not a situation in which too much haste is possible. The speed with which one suspect has been identified is encouraging, and other breaks will come. However, since our unified goal is to bring all suspects successfully to trial, it should be emphasized that this investigation will take time, perhaps weeks or months at that scene. I'm accompanied today by Mr. Thompson and Mr. Brown, and we'll be happy also to respond to your questions.
Mr. McNamara.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I'm Ambassador Thomas McNamara. I'm the coordinator for counterterrorism at the Department of State, and I want to thank you for this opportunity to come and describe the State Department's cooperation with law enforcement in these terrorism cases, in particular with respect to the investigation of the World Trade Center bombing. I'd like to express on behalf of the Secretary of State and all of us at the State Department our sincere condolences to the victims of this terrible bombing, and to assure them and all Americans that our commitment is to assist in bringing the perpetrators, whoever they are, to justice. The State Department's role in terrorism within the United States is limited. As you can understand, our focus and our expertise is in international terrorism. Yet we have an important role in assisting those directly responsible for domestic criminal investigations of the sort that is underway now in New York. Let me preface my remarks, Mr. Chairman, by saying that at this point, we are not saying that this bombing is a case of international terrorism. It may be, it may not be. The investigation will determine that. With that preface, I'd like to cite some particulars regarding the current investigation, which are typical of the cooperation that the State Department gives to law enforcement agencies in domestic terrorism cases. Even though there have been arrests in the case, the investigation is far from over. As a result, all of our embassies overseas have been tasked to report any information they may acquire concerning the bombing so that it may be brought to the Joint Terrorism Task Force in New York. And that task force can have the benefit of this information as it continues the investigation. We are monitoring as much as we can overseas any information and bringing it very rapidly and on an expedited basis to the task force. We are also responding to any specific requests from that task force in New York concerning investigative leads that may require State Department action overseas. Thirdly, we're participating in the task force investigation with agents from the Bureau of Diplomatic Security at the State Department. We provided, for example, the task force in New York with specialized vapor detection equipment to help identify explosive compounds. Next, we're also helping with on-scene investigations because State Department officials have had experience and have had quite a bit of experience in investigating major bombings overseas, especially car and truck bombings. Finally, we are a partner in the intelligence community's intensive review of U.S. intelligence to determine if there is any information that is potentially useful to the investigation. One lesson that the U.S. has learned in the mid-1980s is that effective coordination within the U.S. government is absolutely essential to counter the threat posed by international terrorism. Countering terrorism calls upon intelligence, law enforcement, diplomatic, and at times military capabilities. The system operates continually and effectively, and it is put to the most important test during periods such as this, or such as the one following the Pan Am 103 bombing. Another critically important element in cases of international terrorism is the cooperation of friendly governments to frustrate the terrorists, and when that fails, to identify, locate, arrest, prosecute, and sentence those guilty of criminal terrorist acts. The most successful efforts against international terrorism have come when that cooperation between nations has been strongest. The State Department has the lead role in developing and fostering that cooperation, and we devote substantial resources to that effort. With respect to intelligence, this information moves electronically between agencies, analysts exchange ideas, personnel from agencies within the counterterrorism community, and with those responsibilities are detailed to serve and staffs of various agencies. Capabilities are exercised and a myriad of other steps are taken to ensure that the best information possible can be brought to bear to detect, deter, and to counter the terrorism, and when necessary, to identify perpetrators of terrorist acts. All of the elements of this interagency cooperation are being used to support the FBI, New York Police Department, and the other agencies responsible for the World Trade Center investigation. The investigation is still in its early stages. Based on our experience, for example, with the Pan Am 103 investigation, collecting forensics information will be time-consuming. But I hope that it will ultimately provide the clues which will identify others who may have been involved in this terrible bombing. Should the trail lead beyond our borders, the Department of State is prepared to work to get the cooperation of other nations and governments to assist the investigation. We want to assure you and all Americans that if a foreign terrorist group or state is determined to have been involved in this despicable act, we will not rest or be satisfied until those responsible are brought to justice. There is no higher obligation of government than the protection of its citizens, and I can assure you that it is the view of the President, the Secretary of State, and all of us in the Department of State. And as in the case of the Pan Am 103 bombing, we will follow the trail of the evidence wherever, and I repeat, wherever it may lead. Thank you very much, and I'd be pleased to answer any of your questions.
Well, let me thank all three of you for your excellent testimony, and I'm sure we all have some questions. First, Director Sessions, you mentioned, based, of course, with the caveat this is all speculation. Obviously, if it weren't speculation, we'd be able to predict the future, and we probably wouldn't need hearings like this, a Congress, an FBI, or anything else. But let me ask you, in the realm of that, you said that you didn't think there was going to be an increase in terrorist activity in the United States, or no signs pointed to it. Could you please elaborate on that? Because I guess the concern all Americans have, in light of what happened here, in light of what happened in front of the CIA a few weeks ago, and in light of the fact that we're no longer in a bipolar world, in other words, somehow or other the United States is the focus of everybody. Could you please elaborate on why it is the thinking of the Bureau that this kind of domestic terrorism, which we all hope you're right on the money and know that no one can predict, but why do you, can you tell us a little more about why you think it will not be on the increase?
Mr. Chairman, I believe that history is on my side. If you look at the chart over here to the left with yellow lines, you'll see that at the time terrorism became a priority mission within the FBI, there were over 100 acts in 1981, and by 1982 it was reduced to 51, and it steadily plummeted on down. There was one year, 1986, when it went up to 25 incidents in the United States. Right. So that predictor there of the reaction of law enforcement and the intelligence agencies within the United States to help cope with, through the preventive mechanisms, the threat of terrorism has been very comforting. A second thing I would say, and it's in the short-term memory, but it's history nonetheless, at the time of Desert Shield and before Desert Storm, there were repeated encouragements by Saddam Hussein to take the war to the aggressor. And I took those at that time, and everybody knows I did, as potential threats of terrorism in the United States. We were at peak efficiency. The sharing of intelligence internationally, the work of all these agencies you see before you here, meant that we were, in fact, prepared for it, and it did not happen. And the interdictive capability, through the use of the intelligence, through the cooperation of the American people, all these factors make it possible for law enforcement to carry out its responsibility. And there is no reason I know of to suggest that any of those factors do not exist right now.
You're basically saying, let me ask the question this way. Is it that there have been fewer attempts or more attempts, and I don't mean actual success or even getting a bomb in a car, but people trying to come to America for these kinds of political purposes, and it's that our law enforcement is much better at it than we were 10 years ago? In other words, is it that we are less a focal point, or is it that we're just as much a focal point, but your efforts and your agencies, the efforts of the other agencies, have made us more successful in thwarting those who would come here for those types of terrible actions?
Maybe the answer to your question, or part of it, lies in the chart again on the left. If you take and add up the column of terrorist incidents in any one year and the preventions in any one year, those first two columns on the left, you can see a combination of events of both reactive capability to the events that happen and the prevention. Mm-hmm. Yes, I think law enforcement is better. I mentioned, for instance, in my written testimony, the Trevi Conference on Terrorism in Europe, where the ministers of justice and interior gather every 6 months, and the working groups behind those continually work not only to deal with terrorism, but to plan for how we will react, to share intelligence, to share training, to share these things which will allow us as a community working together to actually prevent the acts that were in such well, there were so many of them.
Let me ask you this. Do we have to be concerned about terrorism from different kinds of groups than the groups that have tried this traditionally in the past? Drug cartels, for instance, perhaps domestic religious groups like the one in Waco, Texas. What's your view of that? Well, we live in such a changing world.
My view is that we have to be very, very careful lest we ascribe certain tendencies to a particular group. I can remember over the years that certain new groups in this country were supposedly suspect groups and went through, as an ethnic group, a great trial and tribulation simply on account of their ethnicity, and we should not do that. I think what has to guide us is what are their activities, what are they doing, what are they doing, what do they intend to do, what are their motives and their claims, so that we look at all these things and then decide whether under our very tight Attorney General guidelines, whether under the policy of the United States, we can in fact deal with that particular activity of that particular person or group of persons.
Right. I know that the way the Justice Department works, you're not allowed to comment on specific legislation such as we have introduced And we're waiting, of course, for an Attorney General who should be here hopefully shortly, so that we can get on with that. But let me just ask you in general terms, what's your view of what we can do to reduce our vulnerability further in the areas of explosives, in the area of immigration, in the area of new types of potential criminal statutes?
Generally speaking, Mr. Chairman, in the area of explosives, I would refer to the expert on my left, Steve Higgins, who is the Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms Director. In the area of immigration, I would refer to the Immigration and Naturalization Service in the Department of State. I read the proposed legislation that you have, and I know that there are parts of it that the FBI has previously supported and previously evidenced a strong interest in it. So I would expect that we will make those views known to the Department of Justice, and that there will be a reaction by the Department of Justice.
Director Higgins, or perhaps Mr. Brown, would you talk a little bit about the explosives part?
I noticed an earlier question when someone talked about how easy was it to go in and buy dynamite,
yes.
And I was thinking at the time, and obviously we've thought a lot in the past, you can go in and buy dynamite in many states as easily as you can go in and buy a gun. You fill out a form.
No restrictions.
Limited restrictions. You fill out a form and state that you're an eligible person. I think if the committee is looking for things they might consider, you might want to look at some of the things that you're considering doing with respect to the gun area, with increased identification, whether or not you're going to have a waiting period. I mean, there's a balance between inconveniencing the industry, and you have to weigh that. But I think many of the thoughts might be the same. So I think you should look in that area. Taggants, you may have some questions on. I'll be happy. I think.
Well, why don't you address the issue of taggants? Is there any dispute? I know we've had some opposition 10 years ago when we tried this from, of course, our friends at the NRA. Do you know anyone who, aside from people from the NRA, who dispute the fact that taggants would be a useful tool in law enforcement?
Well, since I don't know everyone, I won't give you an answer to that question. But I brought with me, as a matter of fact, back in the late 70s when we were looking at taggants, we were actually looking at two types, as you'll recall. We were looking at a type of post-blast taggant. We call that a detection taggant that would seep out and could be detected by certain types of machines, and that would be helpful in trying to prevent bombings before they occur. We also talked at that time about some types of microchips in which we would code some identifying information with respect to when a particular explosive was made and who made it. And this was the mock-up of the chip that we used that time. Obviously, this would be microscopic and not this large, but this would go into explosives, and it would be helpful in the identification for post-blast. And you would go in and could recover this. In fact, we had, on one occasion, a test of this, and we found in one bombing that this had been used. So
it also might serve as a deterrent to those who were going to use explosives, I would imagine.
I think that knowledge would be helpful.
Okay. Let me ask the Director Sessions again. What information, one of the things that's troubling lots of people here is the activities of Sheikh Rahman in terms of, not in terms of a link to this crime, which hasn't been established yet, but the fact that he was on a particular watch list in the country for almost 2 years after his tourist visa expired. Did the FBI know that he was on the State Department's terrorist list and was linked or potentially linked to the assassination of Anwar Sadat? I mean, what kind of intelligence information did you have on the Sheikh? We're trying to determine why it's taking so long for the legal process to remove him. I think 2 years is a little bit long when somebody's on the known terrorist list.
Mr. Chairman,
and I know that's not your jurisdiction, but
well, respectfully, we are in the middle of an investigation. I think it would be, with all due respect, inappropriate for me to comment about those things. It may be that we did know that he was on that list. I would think, secondly, that that question as to whether or not he was on such a list and what actions have been taken might be directed at the Immigration and Naturalization Service to answer more fully.
There's just nobody home there right now, but we will have follow-ups on that issue.
Thank you, sir.
How about State? Could you answer that, Mr. McNamara? It's your list.
Well,
The case of Sheikh Omar Abdulrahman, he was issued a visa in 1990 in error by our embassy in Khartoum.
Tourist visa.
He was issued a tourist visa, correct.
And what was the error?
The error was that he had, in one or another transliteration of his name, been placed on a list of a lookout list. Could
you describe the lookout list for us?
The lookout list would contain the names of people who are suspected of being involved in either terrorist activities, any types of illegal activities overseas, such as drug trafficking or organized crime. It would also include individuals who've been involved in violence. The Sheikh had been arrested and tried in the case of the assassination of Anwar Sadat, and he had subsequently also been involved in some illegal activities in Egypt. We do not have a record explaining why the visa was issued, except back at that time we did not have the automated system that we have right now for the transmittal of names, and indeed we still have the problem of transliteration of names from Arabic into English, so that
Spelled differently.
Pardon?
You mean
widely differing spellings can occur. Without saying why it happened, the visa was issued in error. When it was discovered...
and how was it discovered?
It was discovered in New York after the Sheikh had arrived there. Was
that 2 days after?
No, I think it was some time after. He arrived in the U.S. in late July of 1990, and we revoked his visa in November of 1990. The revocation of the visa meant that he would have to leave the United States fairly soon thereafter. The fact is that in April...
Could you just, and I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I just want to get this all down. How did you discover the fact that he had come here? Is this routine? Everyone is checked or checked through a second process? Did someone alert you to it?
No, I don't have the answer to that. I'll get that for you. I believe that we were alerted to it. There's no follow-up. There's no follow-up after they come in. The Sheikh then appears to have moved his residence from Brooklyn to New Jersey, where he applied to the INS under a different name for permanent residence status in April of 1991. The name was Omar Ali, which is part of his name, but which is not the critical element of his name. The INS office in New Jersey, in Newark, issued him a green card, that is permanent resident alien status. This status was revoked in March of 1992 by the INS. At that point, or shortly thereafter, the Sheikh applied for political asylum. That case is still pending in the immigration court. The asylum hearing, he has had 2 of them, and we are waiting for a decision by the judge in the case. The last hearing was on January 20th of 1992. There has not yet been a decision.
Okay. So in other words, to sum it up, while you were in the process of deportation, he asked for political asylum, and that is the process that has extended and taken things as long as they have.
That is what is now under examination.
Okay. Mr. Fox, let me ask you this, and this will be my last one. I have a few more, and I'll try to come back, but I want to give my colleagues a chance. You were quoted on CNN last night as saying that it was your gut feeling that a large terrorist organization was behind the bombing. Could you explain that a little more to us?
I think that's all it is, Chairman. It's a gut feeling. Those of us who have worked terrorism and counterintelligence matters for many years, from the first day you see an incident such as we have here, you develop certain feelings and suggestions, and you talk among yourselves, the old professionals, the tough old veterans at the office. And I think from early on, we were reluctant to say this was a bombing, but it was a bombing. Right. From early on, we were reluctant to say this is a terrorist incident, but now there's a lot of evidence that leads us to suspect it was a terrorist incident. And in the talk among the old veterans, that's the way they're talking, that this is a terrorist incident organized by a large, well-known terrorist group.
A well-known terrorist group. Might I ask you if if you've had experience with this group before.
No, and let me say, we aren't saying it's this particular group.
I understand. That's why I didn't
saying,
ask that question.
Okay, thank you. We're saying it's a group that knows what they're doing, and perhaps not a bunch of ad hoc terrorists coming together at large.
That was my next and last question. Again, we all read the newspapers, watch television, and given our proximity to this, we just speculate among ourselves with far less intelligence and ability than you do. But what you're saying is, if you had to, at one end of the scale is sort of an amateur group that sort of bumbled into this, and the other is a professional group that really knew what they were doing, you would put it at the end, the professional end of the scale.
That's right, Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Fox. Mr. Sensenbrenner.
Thank you very much. I would like to ask some questions of Ambassador McNamara on how Sheikh Omar Rahman got his visa to begin with. He applied for a tourist visa, and as is the case with all non-immigrant visas, the applicant must overcome a presumption of intending immigrancy by showing ties to his homeland and the like. Since Sheikh Rahman spent most of his life in Egypt and applied in the Sudan, do you have any information as to what made the Council determine, even absent the knowledge that Sheikh Omar was on the watch list, that he had sufficient ties to return back home when he applied for this visa?
I do not. I'd rather not speculate, but I would presume that there were some indications of ties to Egypt and to Sudan that justified, in the case of the Sheikh, the assumption that he was merely coming to the United States temporarily. That, in the case of the Sheikh, probably would have been the lesser consideration. Certainly the reason for denying the visa was primarily because he was on our watch list.
How long was this visa valid for?
I believe it was valid for, it was an ordinary multiple entry visa, so therefore it would have been valid for several years.
Was there any cable traffic between the embassy in Khartoum and the department in Washington on this matter?
I'm not aware of any, but I believe there was communication between Embassy Khartoum and Embassy Cairo before the visa was issued.
What type of passport was the Sheikh traveling on? A Sudanese passport or an Egyptian passport?
I believe Egyptian.
The Department in Washington, did the Department of Washington have any knowledge whatsoever about Sheikh Omar applying for this tourist visa?
I do not. We have no record that there was such a communication back to the department in advance of issuing the visa.
Do you know what percentage of the tourist visa applications in Khartoum are rejected?
No, but I can get that for you. I do have
that objection will hold the record open.
Right, records that worldwide in which 20 to 25% of non-immigrant visa applicants are rejected.
Well, there's some countries where the rejection rate is over 90%.
I was in Colombia where the rejection rate was a lot higher than 25%. I would assume that in various countries, particularly such as Sudan, the Middle East, the rejection rate is probably higher. I'll get that information for you.
Well, what I'm wondering is, I can understand how something would fall through the cracks with transliteration of names from the Arabic, particularly before the automated check system was put in place, which was when this visa was applied for and issued. What I can't understand is, given what I suspect to be a huge rejection rate of tourist visas coming from Sudan and other Middle Eastern countries, why the Council in Khartoum viewed this application to be so special that the Sheikh did overcome the presumption that is statutorily applied to everybody who applies for tourist visas, and he got one.
I agree, Congressman. I simply do not know the reasoning that went in behind that issuing of that visa.
Well, obviously something fell through the cracks here.
Clearly.
And I hope the crack is become narrower rather than wider. And one of the assurances that I think this subcommittee would like is other people in similar situations would not fall through the cracks and take advantage of our immigration laws.
I think you can be sure that not just this case, but a number of other cases where there have been errors. When we're dealing, let me point out, with 5.3 million immigrant visas being issued every year, over 6.9 million applications, 7 million virtually applications for visas are made at our embassies overseas every year. The presumption as a result of law and regulation is that people should be granted visas unless there are specific reasons for denying them. And those are rather carefully drawn and strictly drawn. As a result of dealing with such a huge volume of visas over a very extended period of time, and their validity in many cases is for many years, there are mistakes made. And this was one of them.
You know, on the other hand, anybody who applies for a non-immigrant visa has to overcome the statutory presumption that they are an intending immigrant.
That is
I think
correct.
every one of my colleagues here has a whole file drawer full of cases in their local offices of people whose relatives have been denied tourist visas to come to see family in the United States because they were unable to overcome that presumption of intending immigrancy. Again, I think that the subcommittee and the Congress needs an answer on, you know, how this specific applicant was able to overcome that, forgetting completely about the fact that he was on the watch list. I thank the chairman and yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Sensenbrenner. Mr. Edwards.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Sessions, in a recent newspaper article, it was said that the FBI reduced its anti-terrorism squads at the end of the Cold War, and there was a hint of criticism in that. Is that true?
Back in January 1992, I took and transferred from Foreign Counterintelligence some 300 agents and some 25 from terrorism taskings, and I did that at that time and announced that reprogramming at that time. That is correct.
And Director Sessions, there clearly what must have been leaks in the New York incident, and I'm not going to ask who did it, but the question I would ask you and Mr. Fox and any others are you looking into that and trying to find out who was responsible for leaking matters to the press?
Mr. Chairman, pardon me, Congressman, it's a continuing matter of concern.
This chairman has no objection if you call my senior friend and colleague, Mr. Chairman, as well. He is.
I'm accustomed to dealing with him that way.
Right.
I thank my chairman.
The concern that everybody at this table has is always the same.
Yeah.
That is that we not somehow impair our ability to continue our investigation or to present our product to a United States attorney for presentation to a grand jury by somebody talking about various things. Mr. Higgins and I, sitting here, Director Higgins and I have discussed the issuance again of a joint statement that would caution our people and remind all of our people over whom we have control that it's absolutely essential that in a case of this magnitude that they take great pride in what they're doing and be sure that these matters are handled totally within the guidelines, totally within the professional requirements, so that we do not have leaks. Leaks are very difficult to deal with. We have tried in each instance where we have found them to track them back, and will continue to do that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Schiff.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As the chairman said at the beginning of this hearing is as much or more to examine the general situation with respect to terrorism, terrorist vulnerability in this country, as it is this particular tragedy that we are examining in New York. With that in mind, I'd like to turn to Mr. McNamara and ask and again admonishing that you may decline to answer a question if you feel for some reason it should not be answered at this time. But I'd like to ask, generally speaking, is there a concern about the possible existence of terrorism, or I should say the planned happening of terrorism in this country fostered by foreign governments, as a realistic contemporary concern of the Department of State right now?
Yes, certainly. Let me begin by maybe commenting on one of the earlier questions, which is directly related to this one. That is, why has there been so little international terrorism in the United States? There are a number of reasons for that, I believe. First of all, because we have, as I said in my opening statement, a well-developed, well-coordinated counterterrorism effort on the part of the U.S. government. I've been associated over the course of my career with a number of interagency efforts on a number of issues, ranging from arms control to bilateral relations with various countries. I have never seen, nor have I ever been heard about even, or been associated with an interagency effort that has been so well coordinated and so absent, lacking in turf battles and petty jealousies as in the case of the counterterrorism community. I think it's a paragon of how interagency coordination ought to work. That is a big reason why there is so little terrorism, international terrorism here in the United States. We do have a well-developed counterterrorism effort. Second reason is geography. We are relatively far away from the area where the terrorists are at home and do most of their activities. A third reason is that the United States, unfortunately, offers a lot of easy targets abroad, and the terrorists therefore choose those rather than coming here to the United States. We have more Americans traveling overseas, we have more embassies, we have more American businessmen, we have more American corporations and industries overseas than any other country, and therefore they are targeted. And we hear continually about targets. We are the most targeted country, and our citizens and our interests and our corporations are the most targeted of any country in the world. But it is done overseas because it's easier. The last two reasons I would give, one is, and they're related, one is that there is in the United States an absence of alienated, isolated foreign communities. And I think this is a tribute to our society and to the way we're organized in the United States. When foreigners come here, they come to be integrated into the society. They tend, as opposed to foreigners going, for example, into other countries of the world, they tend to come here with the intention of leaving behind the politics and the violence and some of the problems that they had in the old country. They come here to integrate, to raise families, and to become Americans. And that means, therefore, that the foreign terrorist coming to the United States does not have that fertile ground where he or she can operate relatively free from interference because they're being protected by some small community or society. And the final reason, I think, is the political stability and a responsive democratic government in this country. The issues, the problems of overseas terrorism is much less relevant to the lives of the foreign community, which is looking to, in most cases, to become citizens and permanent residents of the United States. They come here to participate in that and not to destroy it. Those, I think, and those last two are of extraordinary importance in trying to understand why there's so little foreign terrorism here in the United States. That said, we at the State Department, as I said, specialize in international terrorism. We leave to the FBI and the others the questions of domestic terrorism. There is many, many hours devoted by many embassies around the world to examining, collecting intelligence, collecting information, trying to work and cooperate with all sorts of governments, some of whom we're not all that delighted to have to work with, but nonetheless, they're willing to cooperate with us in counterterrorism activities. And we do, to the best of our ability, mold and foster that type of cooperation that, in my opinion, has been one of the major reasons why we have been able to keep the foreign terrorists out of the United States. Our defense begins many thousand miles away, long before the terrorist ever gets off the plane at JFK or some other airport or slips across the border from Canada or Mexico. And that long-range defense has been an enormous asset over the years. That has helped to bring down those figures that you see on those charts. And when you combine that with the well-developed counterterrorism effort on the part of the FBI and other law enforcement here in the United States, I think that helps to explain.
Can I ask, if I may have a moment, Mr. Chairman, to ask one follow-up question? Mr. McNamara, I appreciate that. but I would like to ask, in the opinion of the Department of State, are there governments at the other end of that, other end of that chain? In other words, are we looking at the possibility that some foreign government or governments, not simply residents of their countries, may desire to cause terrorist incidents in the United States to the extent that we can have a concern about it?
Yes. State-sponsored terrorism in the last decade has been the most serious problem that we have faced in the international terrorism world. State sponsors of terrorism have been the major reason for most of the terrorist success in the international field over the last decade. Without the state sponsor, the terrorist organization is much less capable, much less able to carry out these acts of these criminal explosions and other acts of assassination. The State Department has made as its primary objective over the last few years, in fact, well into the last decade, the reduction of state-sponsored terrorism. We have a state sponsors list in which governments, nations are placed on that list as designated to be state sponsors of terrorism. We sanction them. We continually investigate other indications of state sponsorship of terrorism around the world. We have, as one of our primary goals and objectives, the elimination of state sponsorship of terrorism.
Right. Thank you, Mr. McNamara. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Schiff. Mr. Mazzoli?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I appreciate the testimony of the witnesses. I find myself really in somewhat of an awkward position here because it seems like we've really concentrated in this hearing, at least at this phase of it, by concluding that this was an act of international terrorism, probably state-sponsored, and that these individuals seem to have had something to do with it. And it's hard to frame a question that doesn't lapse over that line and get into sort of accusations. But let me try, if I can, to select out a few things. Just one little piece of just housekeeping. I watched some television the other day which suggested that the mosque that these individuals who have been named today either worship at or operate has been stoned. It has been the object itself of activity. And while the police commissioner is not here, and maybe you all wouldn't know, is there any effort to protect that mosque and the people who do worship there?
I don't know the answer to that question, but I would presume that both on the New Jersey side and on the New York side there is a great effort to be sure that there is no backlash against a community on account of information or speculation that has come to the public's attention through the media.
The chairman corrected me. I appreciate that. This is on the other side of the river in New Jersey. I would appreciate maybe, Mr. Chairman, having some information as to whether or not those television reports are correct, and if so, what effort is being made to make sure that people who just choose to worship at that mosque are not themselves subject to any kind of problem, that the mosque itself is not trashed. I believe, Mr. McNamara, you said that at some point, and again, I hesitate to get into this because it does seem to assign guilt, but there was a green card issued to one of the individuals who's involved here, and that green card was then revoked later. Is that correct?
Well, first of all, let me repeat what I said in my opening statement. We have not concluded this is an act of international terrorism.
Well, let me just back up.
But with
Mr.
respect
Fox
to the green
pretty
card,
much said that using the experience he's gleaned over many years, which I yield to and defer to, he seems to have made that conclusion and seemed not particularly bashful about saying so today. So I wonder where we are here. Do we have some disconnect here at this table?
I think Mr. Fox said that it was a professional major terrorist organization. I don't know whether he said that it was a case of international terrorism, but...
Well, if that's the case, I believe that Secretary Sessions, or Director Sessions, said that there had maybe been only one act of what you call international terrorism from 1992 back to 1982, which would suggest that if there is an act of terrorism, we're almost immediately putting it into the category of international type, or am I misreading the tea leaves here?
It seems to me that almost all of those were not cases of international terrorism.
They're all domestic. That's right.
Domestic. Let me say, with respect to the green card, the Sheikh was granted a green card, Sheikh Abdullah Rahman. The Sheikh is not a suspect, I do not believe. I'll cede to the FBI on this. We are talking about him because of the attention that has been gathered in the press and disseminated about him and his status here in the United States. If we're talking about suspects and/or people arrested, we are not, as far as I know, talking about green card holders other than the Sheikh. Is that correct, Bill?
Again, I would not comment on any part of it, Congressman Mazzoli. I would, in connection with the question asked of Mr. Fox, what was asked of him, as I heard the question, was about gut reaction. And he talked about gut reaction as an internal matter, what people feel. And it sharpens the focus on the reason why we should not speculate, lest that speculation be taken as fact. This is a continuing investigation. It will take months. You'll recall Pan Am 103. It took years for us to be able to parse it all out and to be able to come to a conclusion. So Ambassador McNamara is absolutely on target. We just should not speculate.
Right. Well, since I believe you, Mr. Sessions, brought up earlier Desert Shield and Desert Storm, that era, I was in Congress at that time, and I well remember what happened to some of my friends back home who happened to be of descent from the areas in the Middle East who really were quite concerned about their own personal safety, their ability to make a living. And so I do think that we really should be guarded. Let me just shift very quickly to one last question. Has it been determined that this was dynamite, pure and simple dynamite?
Has not been determined.
All right.
Definitely. Still, it's under investigation.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Geekus.
Chair. Judge Sessions, directing my first inquiry in this round to you, the people on the committee here and the people on the panel, and in fact the whole citizenry, are interested in learning from this experience so that we can embark on a continued program, an expanded program, a target program of deterrence so that these things will not happen again. Deterrence. Your evoking of the statute under which federal jurisdiction was gained pinpoints the correlation between the activities at the World Trade Center and that which we constitute as interstate commerce, thus bringing in any bombing, explosion, etc., that the statute depicts. And also that statute, in talking about when a homicide occurs, would invoke life imprisonment or the death penalty as may be appropriate. It seems to me that in proceeding on this case, in the question of deterrence, that there should be people clamoring on my side in doing everything we can to reimpose the death penalty for these types of things in the federal jurisdiction. Question to you. If, and I'm drawing on your other life as a judge on this, am I correct in trying to draw parallels between the decision in Profit and what this Congress, Profit versus United States, I guess, what was it? In Florida. Profit, yes. Am I gaining your endorsement, shall we say, or at least confirmation, that if the Congress should act to reimpose the guidelines which the first Supreme Court decision obviated or made necessary under Furman, that we could possibly apply this to this case? Now, we're not naming the killers. We don't know who they are. Somebody is a killer out there. When we bring him to justice, I would like to see this Congress be poised and ready to apply the death penalty. And to do so, we'd have to act quickly, and I'm going to ask the chairman to expeditiously provide hearings, just as he did for this issue, on the death penalty legislation which others have produced, which covers this situation. What do you think about that, or don't you want to venture a guess, Judge Sessions?
I think two things. You'll send us all scurrying back to the books to read profit again.
Yes.
And second of all, you will, of course, look to the Department of Justice to take a position in connection with proposed legislation and a very careful analysis of the profit circumstance. What, when you started asking your question, did occur to me was this. When I think of deterrence, I think of those steps that law enforcement can logically take, that the FBI can logically take, that would provide a prevention mechanism for this type of circumstance. And I was recalling the Chairman Edwards' question about my reprogramming of special agents out of terrorism. At the time I did it, the agreement with the Attorney General was that we would, if we found that we had made a mistake or that we needed to come back, he would support me in that sort of reprogramming effort. I do believe that the things we've discussed here today, the training, the sharing of intelligence, the working together and cooperatively, as Ambassador McNamara has discussed, provide a deterrence mechanism in the form of law enforcement activity that can bring about real reduction, a historic reduction in the events that happen in the United States, and that probably becomes our best deterrent in terms of what we can control and how we can actually make those things come about.
Well, I understand that. We're all in agreement on that, and I'm applauding your whole concept and your effort. What I'm saying is that the statute that we're involved in, the one that you quoted right from the beginning, and the one which is the foundation for all that we're all trying to accomplish here, calls for life imprisonment or the death penalty. Aren't they part of the deterrent overall atmosphere which we're trying to create?
I think probably
the penalty?
I think probably if you went back and read the congressional intent on that, you would find that those matters were discussed at some length, and that statute reflects their
And you
intent.
don't disagree with the thrust of the statute that calls for these methods of deterrence?
Well, again, it's not mine to agree or disagree, but to defer to the Department of Justice and its view concerning whether or not that interpretation could be made. I would say the Department will review it at your request.
Mr. Sangmeister.
What? Yeah, I have one quick question, if I'm indulged with
He's just, as you know, the FBI never takes a position.
Yes, I know, but I'm going to force him to eventually. But
take you longer than the time we're going to give you today.
Yeah, all right. Mr. McNamara, one quick question. When you said that the Sheikh at some point when he was given a court order to forego his green card and be deported, claimed political asylum. Yes. What was his assertion as to political repression from the Sudan or from Egypt or from where? What was his assertion as to where persecution came?
It had to do with Egypt, yes.
Egypt.
Egypt.
All right. I have no further questions.
Thank you, Mr. Geekus. Mr. Sangmeister.
Mr. Geekus is my colleague's information in the bill that is shortly going to be before this committee that is being proposed by the chairman and others. The death penalty is very much included therein. So you may want to take a look at that. I guess the question I'd like to ask...
Probably has different procedures than the one that Mr. Geekus would recommend.
That's the point.
So that the committee is not in a position of being accused of a knee-jerk reaction to what's happened here. And eventually we're going to have to take a good look at this legislation. I understand, I believe, Director, you said that you had a chance to maybe just thumb this through and look it through.
I scanned it here today, yes, sir.
Yeah, what we're doing here, of course, is creating a domestic terrorism act, which, as defined, says, as used in this section, the term terrorist act means any state or federal crime of violence. You see that this is, as long as you have reviewed it, is a good piece of legislation, something we ought to be doing. The laws on international terrorism not adequate at this point. These matters that maybe we best reserve to the states, and I know already we had the question in New York as to who is going to take jurisdiction. What are your thoughts?
In going through it specifically, there are a number of different sections where the FBI has either directly supported or proposed a particular proposal here, or where we supported it. So there are a number of sections that do have the FBI's view that, as translated again to the Department of Justice, that we should support that sort of enactment of legislation.
Dr. Higgins, do you have any? comment on the legislation?
Treasury Department has the same rules that Justice Department has in terms of who comments on legislation, so I don't...
Department's in the same position?
Yes, I've glanced at this as the director did just before we sat down here, and I note that there are about a half a dozen items in the bill which were before the Congress in previous session, and in fact were included in the omnibus crime bill. The State Department supported at that time many of them. I couldn't go through them all, but we were going to have to look at this, and the State Department will have to, the new Secretary of State and the new administration is going to have to decide which it and what it supports and what it doesn't. So I can't comment on it. I can only say that in the past, as I said, there were about a half a dozen things that were supported.
If I had answered
yes
in the start what was in my mind, I would have said I think that it is not a knee-jerk reaction to consider legislation. Quite to the contrary, it's an expression of concern that the American people have. And so I think the review of these things and the consideration given to each one of those proposals is well worth the time and the effort of this committee and of the Congress and of the departments involved.
Thank you. That's very helpful to the committee, particularly coming from you. One other question, we don't get hung up on explosives, but let's go to Mr. Brown. Not getting into we had a couple questions that I've asked about the accessibility, the easy accessibility to getting explosives, but what about the makeup of the explosive itself? Do I have to go somewhere and buy that, or do I have to be a chemist in order to get the ingredients to put together an explosive? How simple, I guess, the question really is, how simple is it to put together an explosive device?
Well, it's relatively simple. I mean, there's people out there, no doubt, that can make all types of explosive devices that are not trained chemists or scientists, so it's relatively easy to make an explosive device, either a large device or a small device.
So then if we tighten up the laws and who has access to those explosives may not be all that helpful, because you can buy a book somewhere apparently and you need this ingredient mixed with this ingredient with this kind of a timing device that a person can very easily put together a powerful explosive device.
There are all types of available literature on how to make various types of destructive devices on the market very easily, very accessible.
That's all I have.
Thank you, Mr. Sangmeister. And just one comment on the legislation. It's obviously not written in stone. Much of it we worked on last year, part of the crime bill, the immigration parts passed the House floor last year, and we intend to have a series of hearings on it and modify it as we and probably add to it as we move through. But we wanted a basis which we could bounce people's comments off, particularly since we've been working on this for the last year. Mr. Washington.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, I think that the definition of terrorism, at least in law, is that that's defined in our statute. And I'm sure there are several, but one at least says that activities that involve violent acts or acts dangerous to human life that are a violation of criminal laws of the United States and appear to be intended to intimidate or coerce a civil population or to influence the policy of a government by intimidation or coercion, or to affect the conduct of a government by assassination or kidnapping. And that generally encompasses what I have as layman's terms. Is there anything, is my reach too narrow? Is there something that I'm failing to include that would fit within the ambit of the definition of terrorism?
The definition that I generally use includes those that you mentioned, that is, that it is the use of force or the threat of use of force to carry out political or social aims. The element of intimidation or coercion is inherent in that, and it involves people and governments.
So basically, and without going into the specifics of the situation and the acts that bring us all here together today, we're basically talking about the motives of the individual or individuals who perpetrated this crime. I mean, we know what the crime was. Someone constructed and placed a device that was capable of detonation, which did detonate in the parking garage of the World Trade Center building. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay. And then the question becomes, at least to me, what was the nature of the device itself, and that's what Mr. Brown is expert at, and his men and women are out there doing that now, sifting and combing through all of the forensic evidence that is available at the site, together with information from other sources at other locations, to try to piece together the answer to certain questions. Who did it? What was the nature of the device? And then why did they do it? And am I correct or incorrect in that assessment?
Correct.
Okay. Then and only then will we determine whether it's necessary for Congress to pass another law, because we already have a law that makes that act, if it occurred under 18 United States Code Section 844, punishable under our laws, punishable by life or death because death resulted. Is that right?
I believe you're correct.
So we don't have to face the question of a retroactive application of some future act that Congress would pass. If a jury were inclined to find beyond a reasonable doubt that one or more persons committed an act that violates 18 United States Code Section 844, subsection I believe it is, then they could find a person guilty of that offense and make them eligible for that punishment.
That's my
understanding. I believe that, I have never tried a federal death penalty case, I believe that, am I correct, Judge, that where the United States government seeks the death penalty, then that is the unusual circumstance under which a jury would be called upon further beyond guilt or innocence of the individual?
I have never tried a death penalty case in the federal jurisdiction either, Congressman, and I do not know, but I think that's logical, and if the statute calls for it, that's what would be done.
All right. So then, and we don't know whether these individuals came to the United States within the last week or two, or whether they've been here for several years, right?
Again, I wouldn't discuss any facet of what we know or don't know within the investigation, but for the purpose of discussion, that would be correct.
All right. So the question of whether they slipped through some net that we don't have, that we should have, and blaming and kind of tapping the State Department on the hand might be a bit, again, precipitous, because if the people have been here for several years, if more or all of them have been here for several years, then we're not talking about immigration laws. We're talking, let me ask another question. Now, I presume, and maybe I'm incorrect, and Mr. Brown or someone, I presume that whatever device was detonated was large. It was capable of expelling quite a bit of energy. Is that right?
Again, I'm not an expert, but it did. In fact, in the conclusion, the experts constitute a device, and the damage is obvious. Yes, sir.
There appeared to be rather thick cement between those floors that went down several levels, some 70 feet or so.
That's correct. We've seen that.
And that wouldn't have been brought into JFK on an airplane, right?
I simply do not know whether parts, pieces, I don't know where any of it came from. I just cannot speculate, and should not.
So it might be that we might need to get about the business of tightening up our laws. I mean, the people can come here from all over, that's one thing, and what they have in their minds is something, unfortunately, that no radar detector is going to be able to determine. But we can do something about the pieces or the components that come together in the hands of people who have some nutty thoughts of their own that they bring here with them, or people that are born here, for that matter, that have nutty thoughts that make bombs to begin with, right? So as law enforcement officials, y'all wouldn't be opposed to the Congress going about some serious business of trying to ensure that devices capable of detonations of this kind and character didn't fall into the wrong hands, be they foreign or domestic, would you?
I think that's a positive and a purposeful, meaningful way to pursue it.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Washington. I have a few more questions, if I might. Mr. Brown, given again the reports that we've seen, just following up on the devices, it's pretty clear. Is it pretty clear that most of the stuff that was probably used in these devices could be obtained very easily?
In devices in general, in bombings across the country?
I'm talking about this specific bombing.
Yes, sir, it could.
Okay. And have you ever explored, because we do not have this, we deal with taggants in the legislation, but we have not put in anything further on limitations, following up along where Mr. Washington was, on limitations of these kinds of things. Has ATF, maybe I should direct this at either Director Higgins or Mr. Thompson or Mr. Brown, have you explored any limitations on explosive devices in terms of who can get them? Even if we're not talking about gunpowder, talking about detonators or any part of explosive devices. Has your agency ever explored that?
Well, there are some types of explosive devices under Title II
right.
That cannot be possessed legally or purchased or if must be registered. But in terms of looking at the other types of explosives that are readily available, we have done nothing specific that would meet what you're talking about, and obviously we'd be happy to work with the committee to see if something along that line is possible.
Right. Would you agree, either Dr. Brown or Mr. Brown or Director Higgins, is it fair to say that these things might be too easily available, or is it premature to state that at this point?
Well, I think explosives are easily available.
Too easily available. That's what I want to ask you about. We know they're easily available.
You can steal them. We had 8 tons stolen, 2 years ago, and probably less than that this past year.
What about you, Mr. Brown? I'm sorry,
No,
I didn't mean to cut you off, Director Higgins. I'm sure you were happy I did.
Let me give you an example. The most common destructive device used in the United States in bombings is the pipe bomb. Consists of a pipe bomb. Consists of a pipe, 2 end caps, an initiator, and a blasting cap, some type of initiator. Of course, the powder you can buy, a sportsman use powder for various legal purposes. Pipe is readily available at hardware stores. You can go to a Radio Shack and pick up the remainder of the device. So it is that simple to make a destructive device, whether it be a pipe bomb or anything.
The challenge is that it is very easy to take existing materials that we all need and use and want to see in commerce and put it together in a destructive device.
Very much so, if that's your goal.
Is it harder to make a car bomb? This was a car bomb. You know, in the rest of the world, car bombs are used with far more frequency than they are used here. Would the same rules apply to making some kind of car bomb, that it's very easy and you use just the very same simple devices that other people use going about their normal commerce?
Would be just as easy, if not easier, from my description of how to make
If you could just pull the microphone a little further.
I say it would be just as easy, if not easier, to make that type of device, not saying exactly what was used at the World Trade Center, but to fill a van or a vehicle full of dynamite, all you would need was a booster and some type of initiator source to set it off. So it would be no different, and certainly would not be difficult.
Director Higgins.
We're getting dangerously close to a how-to session now in terms of these things that are available.
We certainly don't want to do that, but as you know, there are books on every library shelf in terms of how-to. So the question I have again is, and I don't have an answer to this myself. I'm not trying to push you in one direction or another, but would it be your gut that these types of explosive devices are too easily available, given the pro and the con?
Yes, they are. How we deal with it is another issue.
That's fair to state. Let me ask Director Sessions just a few more questions. There's been a lot of speculation, and in general, I mean, the FBI, as well as ATF and NYPD have gotten plaudits, and I'm among their first plauditors, applauding. But I guess the question that is out there that people don't understand was the issue of leaks, which Mr. Edwards touched on. And without asking you about an ongoing investigation as to who leaked, did the fact that the first arrest was leaked and public information before there could be private interrogation and follow-up, did that impede the investigation, or might we find later that it did impede the investigation?
Well, the activity that surrounded the investigation at 10:30 that morning obviously might have, the arrest might have taken place later, giving more time to do other things than were done. It may be that it impeded, but certainly you take it as you find it. You do what you need to do at the time you did it, and then hope that you can minimize any inconvenience or any detriment that flowed from that particular activity.
right.
That's not evading your question at all.
No,
It's simply saying
you've
we
answered
just
the
live with
question.
what happens.
And I understand also that the newspaper, which was in the New York area, did check, and I understand that the FBI didn't want to say, no, you can't do that, because you've got to be very careful when any government agency tells a member of the press, no, you can't do that. All I am saying is it seemed to me if you had your druthers, you would have rather proceeded privately for a little while before all the information came out.
Well, that's true in a lot of cases, Mr. Chairman, that if you can pursue it in a more leisurely fashion, it's desirable. But you take it where you find it. There is an intense interest. There was incredible coverage, and that coverage continues.
Right. And then we heard, I mean, I guess the leaks are continuing, because I think last night or very recently CNN reported that there were going to be additional arrests before the end of the week. I'm not asking you to comment on that. I'm just saying that I think from all of our points of view, we have to be concerned about those kinds of activities, and I hope you will pursue them with as much alacrity as you can.
Well, sometimes it's difficult to distinguish between leaks and speculation and rumor mill material that comes and flows through every process, and it's very difficult to deal with.
Okay, let me ask you another about another group, the Hamas group, which is a well-known terrorist group. Not commenting on this specific case again, but as you know, I asked to be briefed before this happened about Hamas in the United States by agents in your office, and they told me that there wasn't too much to worry about, that they weren't doing much in the United States. Do the events of the last 3 or 4 weeks indicate to you that we ought to be taking a second look or a deeper look or a more thorough look at Hamas and Hamas in the United States? I note the Israelis just arrested an American citizen, it so happens, and obviously their justice system is not ours, and we don't vouch for its credibility here. Well, you can't. But that was transporting illegal, I think it was funds, between the United States and the West Bank. So my general question is...
Mr. Chairman, I have some problem, if you don't mind, with I think perhaps this ought to be done in a closed session. We're talking about intelligence matters here.
Well, I would ask the director if there's anything sensitive that he can. I'm just asking about the general organization. If he feels it's inappropriate to answer, he will, as he's done before in this hearing, and we assured him that at the beginning. Go ahead, Director.
Mr. Chairman, you have referred to matters that were the subject matter of briefing. I think it is inappropriate for me to comment on any matters that relate to our investigations or our responsibility under counterintelligence and counterterrorism. And I think the suggestion of Chairman Edwards is appropriate, that if there's that kind of discussion, it might be in closed session.
I don't think we'll go into closed session and ask everybody to leave on this if it's okay with the Chairman, but we'll follow it up at a later time in a later place in a closed briefing, if that's okay.
Again, I would not want to be a participant in fueling speculation, and I think it's inappropriate for me to do that.
Let me move on to I have a couple more questions here, and then I will be finished. Let's see. Nope. No. Nope. Okay. If I have others, I'll submit them in writing. I think I've gotten through most of them. I want to conclude, unless anybody else. Mr. Mazzoli, go ahead.
One quick question, maybe of Ambassador McNamara or whoever would care to. There has been some thought here that perhaps the asylum laws of the nation allow people to stay in the country for prolonged periods of time while their asylum petitions are being played out. And the current law allows individuals even 2 different claims of asylum, each of which could be played out in the court process. Do you see in your work now any advantage with respect to terrorism, which is your field, any advantage were the laws to be changed to give individuals fewer bites of that apple, or to somehow streamline the proceeding so that it could move more swiftly and reach a determination of yes or no on asylum?
From the perspective of counterterrorism, Congressman, yes, the laws could use change, tightening up, in order to ensure that legitimate asylum is treated and that cases are adjudicated much more rapidly than they are. It seems to me, again, from the point of view of counterterrorism, that the system is overloaded. It takes months and years before even simple cases get through and individuals are asked to leave or it's decided they can stay. Therefore, the individual doesn't know. He's left in uncertainty as to whether he's going to stay. And those who are up to no good and are in fact illegally here with intentions of staying illegally go about their business while they await adjudication. It's unfortunate, I think, that in the current circumstances, the vast majority of illegal immigrants, once they set foot on U.S. soil, however fraudulently or deviously they arrived here, they need not fear expulsion. The system simply does not get to them. And without adjudication or with very late adjudication, they wind up staying here. It seems to me, from the point of view of counterterrorism, that the laws and regulation in effect now are unable to secure our borders from illegal immigrants.
Thank you for that direct answer, Mr. Sessions. Or Director Sessions, have you an opinion on that simple question with regard to this issue of possible terrorism, and would your job and the people in your office, your associates, be made better were the asylum laws of the land to be changed to quicken the process, though keeping it just and fair, to yield the answer of yes or no on whether a person should remain as an asylee?
Well, I am no expert on it, but I would adopt the statement made by Ambassador McNamara. Obviously, when the system is not able to function to carry out the exclusion where there should be an exclusion, or it simply doesn't focus sufficiently on it to get it done, or the time factors are so extreme, then the system is not working properly. And I would adopt his approach to that, although I would defer, of course, to the Department of Justice.
Director Higgins? Something. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, and you've given me time, Mr. Mazzoli, to get my last question out here, which is a simple one, but I think an important one, and that is asking all of our Director Higgins, Director Sessions, Mr. McNamara, do you have sufficient resources to deal with domestic terrorist threats today?
No.
Yeah, that one is as unclassified as the briefing I received before.
Mr. Chairman, it obviously it has to be taken in the context of what I did in January 1992.
Right.
I felt that I could safely reprogram those that I did. There was some considerable disagreement about doing that within the FBI itself.
Right. It's not my intention to second-guess that decision. It's my intention to look from this point on now and see if you have what you need.
But there are the agreement by the Attorney General that he would join me in seeking reprogramming of those resources back if the need came was, of course, one that I appreciated. I would say in the other areas, that is the technical support, the analytical support, those things where we seek in our budgets to justify them, we are always concerned about resources, and when these extreme circumstances happen, just like with the World Trade Center circumstance, it does put great stress on our resources and those people who are programmed, because what happens, we will always react, but we will take the resources from another program to be able to do it. Our target staffing levels in terrorism this year will obviously balloon. We will have to evaluate and carefully come back and then justify what we need in order to meet the threat as it appears.
Mm-hmm. Director Higgins?
Judge Sessions correctly described and almost directly described the way the process works in ATF, and we will take those resources from other places because we need to get this job done up there. If additional resources are needed, I'm sure that the department will come back to the Congress and ask.
Okay. Okay, well, let me first thank all of you for coming. Charlie Thompson, we didn't get any questions over to you, but I want to thank you for your capable job that you have done running the ATF office in New York, as well as Mr. Fox for the FBI office. Again, I think all of your agencies, the ATF, FBI, and all of the agencies that are looking into this have done our country proud up to this point, and we salute you for it, and thank you for your availability to answer these questions. It's going to help us, as you correctly stated, Director Sessions, improve the laws so we can do even a better job. Thank you. Okay. Yeah, we have another panel. Should I go up and thank you? Want to take a 5-minute pit stop break? Yeah.
Okay.
We're going to take, if that's okay with the remaining witnesses, a 5-minute break for pit stops, etc. 1:30. We'll start at 1:30.